The program tonight by asking the candidates to introduce themselves and take a minute or so to introduce yourself and tell us who you are. And we'll start with Leah Phifer. Leah?
Sounds good. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Leah Phifer, and as Pete mentioned, I am seeking the DFL endorsement to represent the 8th Congressional District. I grew up down the road from here in a little town called Two Harbors, Minnesota. I come from 4 generations of men who worked in the Iron Range mining industry and 4 generations of women who ran small businesses, mostly restaurants, up and down the range. However, I did not go into either small business or the mining industry. I spent the last 10 years working in federal law enforcement throughout positions at the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI. I left my position with the FBI last May, submitting a resignation just a couple days after our illustrious president fired my boss, Jim Comey. I knew that we were on a road that I could no longer be on, as I see this presidency and this administration as one of the gravest threats to our national security. So I'm excited to be here with you today so that we can talk about issues that truly keep our country safe, building a robust infrastructure, economic, educational, and healthcare system for everyone in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah Phifer. Jason Metsa, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us who you are?
Yeah, I'm Jason Metsa. I'm a ranger, a legislator, a husband, a father, and as my wife and I were wondering as new parents what life was going to be like for our son, we couldn't really figure out an answer, and that scared us. And we know that we're not the only parents out there wondering what life's going to be like for their kid, and that's no way to build a strong foundation for them. And it's why in the legislature I worked to pass the minimum wage increase and level the playing field for women at work with the Women's Economic Security Act and champion paid family and medical leave. I think Washington needs a dose of what we worked on in St. Paul, and we have to get out there and raise the minimum wage on a federal level. We've got to make sure that women have equal pay for equal work, and everyone in this country should have access to paid family and medical leave legislation. If elected, I'll work hard to make that happen for you.
Thank you, Jason. Joe Radinovich, before we start, the audience wants to know, Croatian or Serb? You don't have to answer that. We tell us who you are and a little bit about your background, please.
I appreciate that, Pete, and I know better than to answer a question like that from a bunch of people I don't know. I come from Crosby, Minnesota. My name is Joe. Can't hear you. Oh, Mike.
Testing.
All right, well, we'll improvise for a second here. Can you hear me now?
No. Testing.
Is it good now? This one was working. Is that working? This is, oh, there we go. Okay. Well, I just want everybody to know, if you couldn't hear me in the back, I started with a funny joke and things got better from there. My name is Joe Radinovich. I came from Crosby, Arrington, Minnesota. I come from a family of hardworking people, miners, electricians, plumbers, pipe fitters, healthcare workers, the people who are most impacted by changes in the economy. I think that elections are always about the future, or at least they very much should be about the future. And for too many workers here in the 8th District and across America, the future is uncertain. And one of the reasons that is uncertain is because of an example I like to use close to home here. In 1980, there were 14,500 iron miners on the range producing 40 million tons of iron ore. Fast forward 35 years and it's 4,500 iron miners producing that same amount of iron ore. People are being displaced by technology and mechanization, and it's happening on farms and in factories and in mines. It's happening in grocery stores, and it'll be happening more and more on the road with driverless cars coming our way. While our country grows wealthier and more productive than it ever has been before, workers are taking home a smaller slice of the pie. So I think it's very important that as Democrats, we recognize that we have an obligation to put forward policy solutions that address this changing economy. I suggest we should invest in healthcare, education, and childcare, because as Democrats, we know that a job is more than just a job. It's about dignity and identity and the ability to take care of the people you love. That's why this election is so important.
Thank you, Joe Radinovich. Kirsten Kennedy, you want to tell us who you are?
My mic went off. Pass the mic, fellas. Listen, I'm a mom of 5. I I want to talk about this election. This election is not about fear, it's about hope. This election is not about hate, it's about our shared humanity. I will work hard every day about issues that are important to me as a mom, as a mayor, as a citizen of the United States of America. We need to create living wage jobs, protect pensions, Medicare, and Social Security, strengthen unions, not destroy them, protect tribes' rights, preserve their rights to have their lands, and honor the treaties that have been written. I want to safeguard our farmers' ability to sell their products. We need to get money out of politics. Before this election would be nice, it's not going to happen. We need to reduce homelessness and take care of our vets that have served their country so valiantly. We need to talk about defending immigrants, not destroying them. If you're not indigenous, you are an immigrant. We need to care for our children, and we need to make a commitment to investing in public education, pre-K through college. We need to face climate change and be honest about it. Expand high-speed internet, increase voter registration, and we need to make our commitment to a green economy. To do that, we have minerals we need to get. We need to use the latest technology, science-based practices, environmentally sound, permitting, including health impact studies, to get mining right.
Thank you, Kirsten Kennedy. Michelle Lee, do you want to tell us who you are?
Well, my name is Michelle Lee, and for over 40 years I was a journalist. I retired at the end of 26. First attempt at living in as a non-person on the media, I jumped on a bus out of Duluth, Minnesota, and headed to the Women's March in Washington, and it felt good to take a stand. I agree with what all these panelists have said. We have a really great flight of candidates, and I hope you take the time in the next couple of weeks to really get to know each and every one. But what I want to talk about is one of our biggest problems that we're all facing. President Donald Trump rode into office with the slogan, "Make America Great Again." That's looking backward. And look at what his backwards thinking has given us in the first 439 days of his administration. This Republican administration is working hard to divide us as Democrats, divide us from our friends and neighbors who may belong to another party. As we fight amongst ourselves, the corporations in the top 1% grow stronger with the power to handpick our political leaders. The words liberal and progressive have become negative. District, this state red. When I think about education and healthcare systems, that thought frightens me. When I think about their opinions on unions and collective bargaining and how they want to destroy them and have right-to-work states, that scares me. When I think about their assault on our environment, that frightens me. And when I think about their war, anyone in this room mad. But you know, support in this race.
Before we get to the issues, and we will rotate who starts, so I'll get to go with you next, Jason. Jason Metsa, what makes you think you're qualified to represent us in Congress?
Well, I guess I'll get this ready to Pat.
I'm asking what Jason thinks makes him qualified to be a Congress member.
I've served in the legislature for the last 6 years and got to work hands-on on a multitude of bills. I think that the experience there of being in the majority was exciting. We were able to move people's lives forward with historic investments in education, with making it legal to marry the person you love, with passing things like the Women's Economic Security Act, raising the minimum wage, and then we lost control. Elections have consequences. And the consequences of that have been gridlock in St. Paul for quite a while. And one of the benefits, though, of being in office is building relationships and learning how to work across the aisle. And I've done it in our communities, and I've done it at the Capitol for the people I represent. And with those relationships, I was able to be productive in bringing home some really good projects, like the Highway 53 bridge. We were building bridges in my district, not walls, with Republican leadership. And I'm proud of that because it used 10 million pounds of American-made steel. Those are some examples of things we can do together. We also work to pass base funding for a USDA certified processing center at the NERC facility just north of Duluth. And that funding will enable our local farmers to bring their product to market without having to travel too far and build a more sustainable food market here, which I think people want and need. So with that, I'm a new parent and want life to be better for my son and for my wife, to make sure that she's in a job that she makes the same as her male counterparts, no matter what. And I think those are values I can bring to the table because I've done it here in the state of Minnesota, and I can do it in Washington for you.
Would it be fair to say, Jason Metsa, you're saying that your qualifications are, for Congress would be that you served as an effective state representative? Would that be a good way of saying it?
That would be one way of saying it, yes.
That would be my way of saying it. Thank you very much. Joe Radinovich, do you want to tell us what qualifies you to be a Congress member?
Sure. Does this work yet or no? No? Okay. All right, I'll continue to hold this one here. So just by way of resume, I've been a union organizer, I've been a legislator, I've worked on economic development here in rural Minnesota and in northeastern Minnesota at the IRRB. I've managed 2 really high-profile races, including Congress, most expensive and contested in history, and I was the chief of staff of Minnesota's largest city. But more importantly than that are the values that I learned when I was growing up. And I've told many people that are in this audience a story about how those values really crystallized in my life. I came from a family of hardworking people. They're the type of hardworking people who deal with hard times. And when I was a junior and senior in high school, I dealt with hard times myself, and our family dealt with them. My mother was murdered 11 months after. My brother shot himself in front of me, and she was murdered by a family member. And it was in the wake of those tragedies that I understood full well the value of a job and what it meant to be able to take care of the people around you. And so for me, I relied on the teachers and a strong public education system to support me. My dad relied on the health care to provide for my brother and for me. And for his, for my dad, for all his struggles, he had his first bachelor's degree at 30 years old, and we had to rely on Social Security and Medicare to make sure that he didn't lose everything that he had built up over that time. These lessons are real for me, and the values I've learned along the way are what's going to guide me in Congress.
And so to summarize yourself, could you do it in one sentence? Tell us why you're qualified. Not a run-on sentence, one sentence.
I'm grounded in the values I learned back home.
Good, thank you, Joe Radinovich. Kirsten Kennedy, do you want to tell us what qualifies you to be a representative in Congress?
I'm yelling again.
Don't yell.
I will yell. I will not yell, I'll just speak forcefully. I am a single life where I have been part of 2 military families. But most importantly, what I learned as an organizer and then took into taking as a progressive candidate one of the Tea Party hotbeds in Chisago County, Minnesota. We call it the Bible Belt. And working under an extremely hostile council for the first year, using my entire mayor's salary, which by the way is $3,400 a year, to defend myself in court. I had to learn that you never show you're weak. You don't show any emotion. If you need to show emotion, you drive away a few blocks and then have a little time. I learned that you have to lead in a way that makes people want to follow you and come to the table with you. So now as a second-term mayor in North Branch, I work with Republicans, I work with independents, we talk together, we get things done. We were able to pull in the largest solar project in the Midwest, 1,000 acres. We have done more for economic development in the past 4 years than North Branch had seen in 15. It is working regionally and remembering what goes on in our city affects everywhere around us.
Kirsten Kennedy, thank you. So if you were going to summarize this in a sentence, what makes you qualified?
I'm qualified because I will work.
What qualifies you to be a congressman?
When I first came, I was schooled by those around me, the people who had been covering the news in the 8th district, and they told me there's 3 things you have to remember. Well, actually, they said there's one important thing you have to remember. The economy of the 8th district is a 3-legged stool: timber, tourism, and taconite. Those are the important things you have to keep your mind on. Well, since those years, many years have passed, this district has grown. We're now up to 27,000 square miles. And we touch all the way down to the cities, all the way up to I Falls, over to Brainerd, and over to the Great Lake of Superior. We also have farming. We also have technology. We have to add many stools, and we have to create the jobs of the future. Throughout my career, I asked questions. I was a communicator. I sought out people to ask, why is this happening, or why isn't this happening? I listened. I realized that there are more than 2 sides to every story. Sometimes there's 3. Sometimes there's 4. And we get that many sides to a story, you bring those people to the table, and you develop a consensus so we can move forward. And that is important. People might say, well, all she did was read the news. No, I listened. I listened to my friends. I listened to my neighbors. I listened to people throughout the 8th district about their concerns, how they're going to feed their children, the moms that are working 2 jobs and they can't afford to have daycare, and the kids are being dropped off at grandma's house. Those kind of things. Those are the stories that we all need to listen to.
So if you're going to qualify, if you're going to tell people why you're qualified to run for this office, are you saying that it's because you're skilled in communication and your experience as a journalist? Would that be fair to say?
I am saying that I am willing to listen to both sides. I am listening to find the mutual space between those 2 divisions.
Thank you, Michelle Lee. And Leah Phifer, the question to you: what makes you qualified?
Or what looks good on a campaign flyer does not always make good law. That drove me to get my master's degree in public policy at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs so that I could learn how to improve upon the laws that I had been carrying out for the past 10 years. So in summation, Pete, to be your next Congresswoman, because I've spent the past decade in a front row seat to the effects of laws written by Congress, and I have the education and experience to fix them.
Thank you, Leah Phifer. I was going to ask tonight and across the district, are you going to abide by the party's nomination process, endorsement process on April 14th?
Yes.
Kirsten Kennedy, are you going to abide by the endorsement process?
Yes.
Michelle Lee, are you?
I am not going to lie.
What would affect that decision on April 15th, whether you're going to abide or not?
Well, right now we are running, all of our candidates are running. We're contacting the delegates. We're figuring out where we fit into this process, and we're trying to find out if our camping, that includes building out our grassroots, only reasons to leave the race to announce his retirement after our caucuses. A lot of people who caucuses because they believed in their hearts that...
Let me ask you this question. Is there a candidate who is make you decide not to run for the primary?
No. Unless it's me.
So, Leah Phifer, are you going to abide by the endorsement process?
Absolutely.
Joe, I haven't asked you yet, have I? Jason, sorry.
It's okay.
I did ask you.
My dad is, we have 4 brothers, they're all J's, so it's been kind of a lifelong thing. I am seeking the endorsement, and I ultimately think that the delegates will decide at the convention what to do.
Thank you. That's a fascinating topic to me because one of the big reasons people get involved in the DFL party is to make their endorsement valuable and worthwhile. But we all know that many successful representatives in the district did not get the endorsement. So I'm fascinated to see what happens on April 14th, and I'm fascinated to see what's going to happen on April 15th. Well, let's go through some of the questions that people have asked. The first question, and we'll start with Kirsten Kennedy from the audience, is on hemp production. Would you work in Congress with Mitch McConnell to work on hemp production?
Absolutely.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, I wanted North Branch to be part of that. It just did not happen.
All right. And Michelle Lee, how do you feel on hemp production?
I think it's wonderful. Anything that's going to put our farmers to work, I'm on board with.
Thank you. Leah Phifer?
Absolutely. I think it's a fantastic sector to be invested
I
in.
was a co-author. We do that out in Washington.
Thank you. Joe Radinovich?
Yes, and I also think that we should end the federal scheduling of marijuana as a Schedule 1 drug.
Thank you. I did, so I made a note before I did it. All right. Well, this is a good one because Gun control and the NRA, these are huge issues that affect what happens in Congress. We have a Second Amendment that gives people certain rights. We have people who are fanatical about it, and we've got a powerful lobbying group in the NRA that really controlled the conversation until about a month or two ago. So in light of the Parkland shootings, it's inevitable that our next Congress member is going to deal with gun control in some fashion. Could you tell us where you stand?
Well, number one, I'm a gun owner, and I have a permit to carry. I'm a responsible gun owner. My gun is registered, and I think that there should be universal background checks on guns, but I also believe as a responsible gun owner, we need to come to the table with the millions of young people who are leading the way where we, for some reason, thoughts and prayers, every time we see these things, thoughts and prayers, and this last one, thoughts and the groundswelling of thoughts and prayers are just not enough. And we need action. And I thoroughly believe, I came out early on this, that we need to ban bump stocks, high-capacity magazines, and noise suppressors. Also, military-style assault weapons should be in the hands of those who serve to protect us and who are sworn to protect us, not in the hands of those who harm us. Now, Senator Dianne Feinstein, her 2017 bill, 2 of our senators have already signed on to that. It's languishing in committee. It has grandfather clauses to allow law-abiding gun owners to keep certain guns. We should start coming to the table, discussing these things, and getting them out of committee. And our Congress people, whether it's a congressman or a congresswoman, should be agreeing to sign on to those things so we can push sound legislation that will protect our Second Amendment rights. Because, frankly, 300 million guns in this country. You know the size of an army it would take to come to each and every one of our homes to remove those guns? That is not going to happen. Could you imagine the search warrants, the numbers of judges we would have to swear into office to come into our homes to take our guns? It's not going to. If you're a law-abiding citizen, rest assured, the Second Amendment will always be there to protect you. And I know the NRA has done a lot of things to try to frighten their membership, that the people who are against guns are going to come and try to take your guns away or take away the Second Amendment. There's only been one amendment that's been beer and drinking. And my gosh, we liked our beer, and we're all drinking beer again.
Michelle Lee, do you find it interesting that it was the Parkland shooting that seemed to sort of turn the tide against the NRA in this country?
I think that tide was building like a big ocean. Those waves kept hitting and hitting and hitting. And finally, our children had the courage to stand up en masse and school each and every one of us in this room. And now it's up to us as adults to have their backs and move this forward.
Thank you, Michelle Lee. Leah Phifer, can you tell us your stand on gun issues?
Absolutely. Having grown up in northern Minnesota, like many people here, I grew up around rifles and shotguns, and I myself am a sporting clays enthusiast. I also spent the last 10 years with common sense legislation. I was working for the FBI in 2015 when a man by the name of Dylan Roof walked into a church and murdered 9 people. And that could have been prevented. He would not have been able to get his hands on the firearm that he used to commit that atrocity if we had a universal background check in place. In addition to universal background legislation, I would also lines to make sure that we are passing a ban on automatic and semi-automatic rifles, in addition to enhanced background investigations, straw purchases, bump stocks, and high-capacity magazines.
Leah Phifer, what's your take on the Parkland kids?
I believe that the Parkland kids, as many people say, are our future, but we cannot sit back and just assume that these kids are going to be able to do it on their own. All of us here in this room, in this country, have to give them the support that they need and listen to their voices and not just sit back and hope that they will save us.
Jason Metsa, as I've said, if you're elected to Congress, you're going to be dealing with guns probably within the first month of taking your oath. Where are you going to stand on that issue?
I've been a gun owner my whole life, but enough is enough. We've got to do something to fix the systemic problem in front of us. And when I lived in Alaska, when I was 16 years old, there was a school shooting. I was on the student government body in Anchorage. And there were students from that school with us. It blows me away that over 20 years later, those same students who I was with that day, who had friends that were killed, that we have not done anything to address this issue, which is why in Washington, I will support a universal background check system so that a domestic abuser from Minnesota here can't travel across the border to Wisconsin, purchase a weapon, and bring it back to harm their partner. Enough is enough, and we need to change those laws, and if I'm out in Washington, I'll be part of that solution.
Were you surprised to see the Parkland kids having such a big effect on the wave?
No, I think that they should be angry that we haven't done anything, just like I was when we learned of that news when I was living in Alaska. They should have a right to stand up and fight for what they think is the right thing to do, and I think making sure that weapons aren't in the hands of people who shouldn't have them is a darn good solution.
Thank you, Jason Metsa. Joe Radinovich, do you want to tell us about your position on guns and the gun issue in Congress?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, gun violence has impacted my life, and in 2013 in this country, there were about 33,000 gun deaths. About 60% of those, or slightly more than that, were suicides, and the remaining were homicides. Both suicide and homicide has impacted my life, and oftentimes those two are married together in the way that they impact people. The suicides in this country require different policy solutions than the homicides. Waiting periods and background checks and things of that nature can be effective in that regard. When we look at homicides, the vast majority of homicides are committed with handguns, and they occur specifically in high crime, high poverty areas with other factors at play. And we can do things both societally and with regard to gun policy things. Now, when we talk about the tragedy of 10 or a dozen people or 20 people being killed, what we saw there was somebody who was able to go in and purchase a rifle and with little modification shoot hundreds of people in a matter of minutes. Crashed out a window, shot I think 441 people, killing 58. The scope and the magnitude of that damage is something that we can no longer include. Universal background checks, raising the age of purchase to 21, eliminating bump stocks, and also eliminating high capacity.
Thank you, Joe Radinovich. And do you want to comment on the kids in Parkland?
Yeah, I think, I've experienced this in my life, but the young people's ability to use the tools available to them, like social media, to shine a light on things in a unique way is really is inspiring.
Thank you, Joe Radinovich.
Certainly. First of all, I agree with everything that the entire panel said, but one of the things that we are missing here is it has been 20 years, and I thought we should have done something when Columbine happened. We're still sitting around doing nothing, and the CDC has been barred from doing research, publicly funded, for over 20 years. The Dickey Amendment needs to be reversed. We study other kinds of deaths. We need to study deaths by guns. And if we can do that, and we can have facts, we can work across the aisle. With the fool recently had a 17-year-old, and half the kids didn't show up at school the next day, and you know what? They shouldn't. When the teachers went in for training, they said, we're going to train our elementary school students to use forks. Now, I don't know about you, but with an automatic weapon, forks don't matter, handguns don't matter. Frankly, a lot of the firepower my PD has would not matter against someone who could shoot off hundreds of rounds in minutes. We need to make a decision, and frankly, I think we should all be ashamed that Parkland students have to be standing up and fighting when we are the adults in the room. We are elected officials, and it is our responsibility. First off, I want to make sure that no one takes money from the NRA. I'm sure no one on this panel has, and the first step is to actually take money away from the NRA, take away their power, and have it be in its right place.
Very efficient, Kirsten. You asked both questions with one answer. Very nice. But I did want to ask about the NRA, because everyone here on the panel is a gun owner. Everyone has touched on our constitutional gun rights. Why do you think nobody on this panel should or could take money from the NRA?
I think they could take money from the NRA, but as I mentioned earlier, I think we need money out of politics, because elected officials need to make decisions based on what they think is right, not who gave them the most money in the last election cycle.
Thank you, Kirsten Kennedy. And to be fair to the rest of the panel, Michelle Lee, would you accept any campaign funds from the NRA?
Absolutely not. And I think Wayne LaPierre is paid way too much. $1 million this man is earning. And I think that the NRA is carrying way too much power when it comes to selecting our elected officials. They threaten with money If any of us here say we're not going to be supporting the NRA, we're not going to get any of that money. NRA will take their money and send it over to our Republican challenger.
Thank you, Michelle. Leah Phifer, would you take any money from the NRA?
I have already signed the No NRA Pledge, which is online. You can see which of your elected officials have signed that pledge, and I was one of the first to sign it within 24 hours of it opening.
Jason Metsa, would you?
No.
And how about you, Joe Radinovich?
No.
Wow, I think if I was running for Congress, I might actually consider it. I think it might be a smart move for the Democrats to start using some of the NRA money to do what the NRA should be doing, which is taking care of our gun laws in this country and not promoting that kind of violence and hatred. But that's just me. The next set of questions we'll start with Leah Phifer, and that is on pensions. Now, I was just spending Easter with my family on the Iron Range. My sister sent me to the grocery store and told me to buy Peeps. And I said I wouldn't do it because they're trying to bust their union and they're trying to demolish their pension fund. This is a congressional issue. Fewer and fewer companies offer pensions. Companies are trying to figure out how to get out of paying their pensions. It's going to be a congressional issue. Where do you stand, Leah Phifer?
I think that we need to get back to the original problem too, which is looking at the Republican control trying to corrode union membership in general. I am a member of SEIU Local 284, fighting at Augsburg University to improve working conditions and secure better pay and benefits for our faculty members there. I would, in Congress, make sure that we are not allowing this country to become a right-to-work country, so that we can start protecting our unions from the very beginning by ensuring that every worker in this country has the right to collectively bargain, join a union, and earn the good-paying pensions that my family has benefited from for many, many years. I would also make sure that we're working with the Pension Benefit Guarantee Program in Congress and making sure it's fully funded, so pensions that are overtaken by that coalition are fully funded, and we're not giving our retirees 60 or 70% of what is owed to them.
Thank you, Leah Phifer. Jason Metsa, where do you stand and what would you do as a Congress member on the issue of pensions in private businesses?
I was taught growing up that a promise made is a promise kept. And I've worked to that effect in St. Paul. We just talked about PBGC. And right now, people can go bankrupt on that program. And I think that we should fight to make sure that those companies can't go bankrupt on their obligations that they've made to their employees. And
so let me ask you then, are you supporting that an idea that the government might step in to save a pension fund when a company can't?
well, the PBGC is essentially a conglomeration where our Teamsters, if you've read about in the news, have had some major issues lately, and a number of other workforces. And it's designed to be able to be kind of a catch-all so that people can receive their pension still, even if a company goes belly up. But what we haven't done in Washington is make sure that companies can't go bankrupt on that obligation they made to the PBGC, on top of breaking the promise they already broke to their employees. And it's work I've done in the legislature in St. Paul. We've had a pension bill that helped out with our teachers in Duluth. I've had 3 constituents who had mistakes that were made on their paperwork when they were hired from our local community college. All 3 of them, I'm glad to say, this year will have their pensions corrected and the promise that the state made kept. And if I'm in Washington, I'm going to make sure that we keep the promises that other companies and folks have made with the obligations that they set forth themselves for their employees, and make sure to fight so that everyone gets that paycheck they were promised.
Thank you. Joe Radinovich, as a Congress member, what would you do to protect pensions? What's your policy and position?
Yeah, so I think pensions are very important, and I'd echo the statement that my friend Jason Metsa made, which is that a promise made is a promise kept. More specifically, what's happened with the pension fund, for instance, like the Teamsters, is that over the course of many years, some of the employers who were supposed to be meeting their employer obligation to the fund did not do so. They deferred the opportunity to pay that cost, and they were allowed to do so while employees had to keep up their end of the bargain. And so when the bill finally came due, a lot of those companies have been put out of business, and they've been put out of business because of the same thing I've identified is happening across the country, which is technology and mechanization. And so as our economy continues to radically change, it is going to have an impact on companies and their ability to meet their obligations. So I think we have to step back even further and recognize that the changes that we're seeing in this economy are fundamentally changing the deal. The deal, as many of us know, in the 21st century was, the idea that you could show up at work 40 hours a week and you would be able to earn the things necessary to take care of your family. And as I've mentioned earlier, as this country grows wealthier and more productive, a smaller share of people are participating in that work, and they're taking home less of the pay. And so what I think we need to do is have a radical revisioning of what our values mean in this economy. And that means that people who show up to work every day should be able to afford everything from childcare to education to healthcare to retirement in the form of pensions or Social Security or other public programs.
But specifically the pension problem, and that is that companies are going out of business and not honoring their pension obligations. That is an issue that's going to come up in Congress. So could you be more specific about that particular issue?
Let me be very, very specific. If we can bail out Wall Street banks, then we can bail out the pension funds of Teamsters and other workers across this country.
Thank you, Joe Radinovich. Kirsten Kennedy, can you explain your position in Congress if elected on pensions?
Certainly. As with everyone else up here, I agree that we need to protect it. We keep talking about it. A lot of people at the top are getting a good deal right now in this country, and the middle class and the working people are not. And one of the things that's happened is you're correct. Businesses have not paid in, they've gone bankrupt, there's no protections for the employees. We need to honor and talk about an Employee Retirement Income Security Act. We need to make sure that we as government and elected officials do need to get involved and step in, and we need to make sure the economy is built from the middle out, not the top down, which I'm just going to be honest, trickle-down economics is a lie and it doesn't work. And so you work hard in this country. It is not an entitlement. I want to be clear. Pensions, Social Security, and Medicare are something that people work every day and earn. To grow old and have that be taken out from under them, we can figure it out. I think we can reverse the tax plan that just went through, and it would take care of a lot of things.
Reversing the tax plan, is that an agenda of yours if you're elected to Congress?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Kirsten Kennedy. I bet we'll touch on that subject a little bit later, David. Michelle Leah, let me ask you about your policy on pensions and the protection of workers in Congress.
Well, right now, if there were good policy, we wouldn't be sitting here discussing how to protect people's pensions. People who have been working for 30 years, 40 years, whether it's the Iron Range and they're faced with the possibility that their pensions are not going to be there because of bankruptcies to their companies, we should be monitoring that, and as government, we should be requiring these companies to put this money into a safe, Al Gore said it, a lockbox of some sort that the government can monitor and invest, and to ensure that each and every one of these folks who have worked 30, 40 years of their life will see their pensions, and that also goes for our Social Security and our Medicare. There's a lot of spending going on in this country, including our military, that we can start reducing. I just spoke to a young man in the audience today before this debate happened, and he said, all my life, he's 19, all my life we have been at war. This country is really good at creating veterans. We fail when these veterans come home, and that it's our responsibility to have their backs and care for their needs, whether it's their mental health issues or their physical issues. We need to start flip-flopping things and start figuring out where do we want to spend our money. We're taxpayers, everyone in this room, and we expect a good return on the money we're paying into. And we can take this government back. And I see that people are smiling. Hopefully they're agreeing that we can raise our voices in Washington and say, it's up to us. We want to protect these pensions. We want to protect these social programs, because if we don't, all is lost. All we have is our truth, and we can take our truth to Washington and give truth to power.
Thank you, Michelle. You said everyone in this room is a taxpayer. Our president is not here today, obviously. You recall he bragged at a debate that he wasn't a taxpayer. For some reason, that was some kind of honor. So I'm pleased to hear that, everyone here. Anyone not a taxpayer yet? Okay, good. I want to move on to immigration. This is a question that several people have asked about. And the question goes to Jason Metsa. Immigration, for some reason, is all of a sudden a huge issue. Our president, who I just spoke of, ran on that issue, even though he doesn't care about immigration whatsoever. He knew that he could tap into people's difficulty with the immigration problem in this country and make it a big issue of his own. So if you're elected to Congress, immigration is going to be a huge part of what you're going to be involved in. And I think these people here tonight want to know where you stand and what you plan to do.
This country was founded on the idea of opportunity, and our laws don't reflect that, and it's really disappointing. My great-grandfather came over here when he was 15 and worked in an underground mine in Nashwauk. And what he had was hope and hard work ethic. And those are the things that defined us as a country. We need to make sure that our laws reflect where we were founded. And that means instead of spending your tax dollars chasing people out of this country whose only crime is actually being here, and put that money into education. Put that money into the resources that people need for the translating services. When there's a fee to become a citizen, how fair is that to someone? We have valedictorians in this country who came here with the idea that they were in a school in their own home country. And we have policies that tell them to get the heck out later in life. And that's not fair to them. It's not fair to our parents and grandparents. And we need to make sure that our laws reflect the values that we have as a country and change them so that people actually have the resources they need to become a good citizen and pay it forward, just like our parents and grandparents did. And if I'm elected to Congress, I'm going to make sure that we have those resources available to those people.
Jason Metsa, I suspect many people in this room believe that that's a great stand, but if you're elected to Congress and the GOP controls Congress, what are you going to do about the issue if you've got no power over that? The Republicans aren't going to deal like that with immigration.
What I've done in St. Paul for 6 years, you roll up your sleeves and you fight for what you think is right, and you stand up for the values you believe in, and you don't back down on them.
Thank you, Jason. That's it. Joe Radinovich, you want to talk about if you're elected to Congress where you're going to work on the immigration issue?
Yeah, so I would start, America is a beacon of freedom and opportunity, or at least it should be, right, under the right circumstances. And those words that we all know are in places like our Declaration of Independence or in our Constitution or inscribed on the Statue of Liberty, and they send a clear message about what our values should be. We need to bring people out of the shadows. Currently, undocumented workers are subject to exploitation. They drive down wages around them. They're subject to crime at a higher rate, and they're often afraid to report it because of the implications it might have for their immigration status. And people who have had through no fault of their own, have been brought to this country or who have served this country and should have every right to stay here aren't able to do so. And so I support a pathway to citizenship. I think that we need to make sure that we bring these people out of the shadows, we open up our arms, and we include them in our economy and make them understand the full weight of our American values.
Thank you, Joe Radinovich. Kirsten Kennedy, where's your stand on immigration and DACA if you're elected to Congress?
Well, first of all, if you're not Indigenous, then we are all products of immigration. I'm proud tonight to have my dad here, Knut Hagen, 80 years old, who is an immigrant from Norway. I'm glad they let him in. And by the way, the president did say he wanted more people from Norway to come to America. I want you to know that my family in Norway said, heck no, we don't want to come. Here's what I believe, and I'm going to take a little harder stance than many of my counterparts up here because maybe they're just nicer than I am. I think we should defund ICE immediately and save millions of lives. The brutality they use, remember, ICE has only been around for a decade. It was not here before that. We lived peacefully and got along great. Legalize 11 million undocumented immigrants in America would add a cumulative 1.5 trillion to our gross domestic product. The federal government would accrue $5 billion in additional net tax revenue over the 10 years. A Clean Dream Act should have been passed a long time ago. We haven't been able to vote on it in over 10 years. Shame on us. We need to reform our high-skilled immigration system. Immigrants and their children founded 40% of Fortune 500 companies throughout the world. That's $4.2 trillion in revenue in 2010. Our economy benefits from immigrants, and frankly, if you want to talk about terrorism, it's people that look like me doing most of the terrorism in the United States of America.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that most people that commit crimes in large mass do not look like someone other than me, a white person. As in Norway, recently, many of you may know, the worst thing that happened since World War II is a beautiful Norwegian young man came and shot up kids, blew up a building in Norway, and wore a badge saying he was police so that the children ran towards him. When my family woke up the next morning, they did not expect to see someone that was white on that television screen, but Norway handled it differently. They never mentioned his name, they didn't give him any press. All that they've done over the years, and by the way, Norway does not have a death penalty, he's in jail. All that they've done is celebrate the people that died and made a commitment to humanity and standing up for what is right, not participating in fear.
Thank you, Kirsten Kennedy. Michelle Lee, your stance on immigration?
Well, I'd like to tell you a story about a tale of two Republican presidents. First, we had Ronald Reagan, who offered an amnesty program for all of the illegal aliens who came into this country, who had been here for 10 years, the people of the shadows that Kirsten was talking about. As long as they were law-abiding, they became American citizens. That's what we should be contemplating now, bringing these people out of the shadows. There are at least 8 million, possibly many more. Many of them now are paying taxes. They're paying into Social Security. They're law-abiding. We need to find these people, bring them in, and make them legitimate Americans, because for all intents and purposes, they are Americans.
Do you have a plan if you're elected to Congress?
And may I say the second half?
Let me finish the question. If you're elected to Congress and we realize that the GOP might hold Congress,
Yes, indeed.
what are you going to do on your immigration platform, which is honorable and noble? What are you going to do to be effective with the Republican-controlled Congress?
And let me explain the second president, the second Republican president, who wants to build a wall at $70 billion to protect us. $20 billion to maintain that wall. A president who is holding the dreamers hostage. These young kids. These kids are as American as my son and as many of the children in this, young adults in this room. They have worked, they have gone to school, they don't know much about the countries that they were brought from. We have to start coming together and considering how we can use Minnesota values and bring those values to Washington and find other lawmakers from other states who have similar values and figure this out, because we have to figure this out. Right now we have jobs that are going empty because we don't have enough trained people here to fill them. How about expanding our immigration to bring people in who can help us build the workforce of the future?
But the Republicans aren't going to agree with that, and if we don't win back the House at least.
We are going to win back the
And
House.
if we don't win back the House, you're going to serve in Congress, and what are you going to do?
We are going to win back the House. I'm very confident of that. The
Well,
House will be
that leads me to my
controlled.
next question then. You don't have a backup plan in case we don't win the House? That's a bit dangerous.
To bring people from all sides of the table, whether they're Republicans, Democrats, or independents, and figure this thing out, because it's unsustainable the way it is now.
Well, I do agree with you. I hope we win back the House, and I'm confident that we have a good shot at it. But I'm a little more nervous about it than you are, at least what you're saying now. Thank you, Michelle Lee. Leah Phifer, are we talking about immigration still with you? I think we are.
Yes.
So why don't you tell us what your stand is on immigration if you're elected to Congress this fall?
This is a topic that is very, very near and dear to my heart. I was first hired in 2008. I studied Spanish in college and taught overseas for a couple years. So when I came back to Minnesota in 2008, I was hired as a translator in a detention center for undocumented immigrants right here in Minnesota. And for 6 years, I saw up close and personal the toll that our broken immigration system takes on our communities, and how these laws that were written in 1965 have not been substantially altered. Instead, we have had a patchwork of executive orders that come and go depending on who happens to be in power. As Pete said, we cannot bank on whichever party is in power to hopefully give us a just and humane immigration system. We need to make long-lasting, real change. I would begin by reviving the Gang of Eight bill that failed when the Senate refused to look at it in 2013. It was a bipartisan bill that had some problems, but could absolutely be revived in a bipartisan coalition to give a pathway to citizenship for all 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country immediately. Second of all, I would make sure that the RAISE Act, which is currently President Trump's plan to allow a meritocracy-based immigration system to rule the country. When you hear the terms meritocracy, make no bones about it. He is talking about only inviting people with PhDs who come from primarily Western European countries into the United States. So I would make it a #1 priority in Congress to make sure that the RAISE Act never sees the light of day.
Thank you. Leah Phifer, you're the only person on the panel that has actually worked for ICE, isn't that correct? You want to tell us about that?
So, as I mentioned earlier, I was hired in 2008 to begin translating in a detention facility run by ICE in Minneapolis. And what I've seen throughout my time there was that we have a system built on prisons that profit off of the helpless. People who cannot speak for themselves, both literally in the language and also through the laws. I would immediately move to make sure that immigration and any federal agency is not allowed to use a for-profit prison system, and furthermore, is not allowed to use a state or county contract to house anyone being held by the federal government. What I've seen is the state and the counties are ill-equipped to offer the level of care that is required by the federal government, especially for immigrants. So we need to make substantial changes that we can work across party lines by eliminating our for-profit prison system, creating a pathway to citizenship, and making sure we have a just immigration process that allows all levels of education and experience to profit off it here in the United States.
Thank you, Leah Phifer. The question now goes to Joe Radinovich. And sex trafficking is something that's gotten a lot of news and media attention in the last few years. That profile has been raised. The hashtag #MeToo movement really exploded recently. We saw the resignation of what most in this room probably think was a fine United States Senator, Al Franken. And I want to know where you, Joe Radinovich, stand on the issue of women's rights in if you're elected to Congress.
Yeah, so the first part of that question addressed sex trafficking, and sex trafficking affects primarily women, but all sorts of people. And I want to take that issue very separately because I think that is probably one of the worst forms of human misery that I've ever had to encounter in any of the work that I've done. And so when I was the chief of staff of the mayor of Minneapolis, sex trafficking is a very real problem, not only in cities like Minneapolis, but across the entire state and in districts like the 8th district. And what we would see down there is that there would be missing people posters in a certain area of town down there, and there were groups like Natives Against Heroin that would go out on the streets and they would find the people on those posters and they would call police and they'd rescue them off the streets. And these people were sometimes as young as like 10 years old. They were boys, they were girls, they were there largely because of involvement in heroin trafficking and other things. And so, I support safe harbor legislation to make sure that we can pair resources with the counseling and the facilities necessary to intervene in these situations and to aggressively break down any vestige of human trafficking. I think it's about one of the worst things in the world. Now on the issue of women's rights, I think that the Me Too movement has been an appropriate thing, an important thing, and I think that more and more we are seeing women empowered to speak out about things that they haven't previously been, and I think that's a wonderful thing. In my career, I've had the good fortune to work with many talented women, and in my observation, they deal with a lot of things that they shouldn't have to, including some of them who are related to some of those high-profile legislative issues that we saw here in Minnesota where those 2 legislators stepped down. And I've always thought that I can go out there and work on my own merit and succeed on my own talent, and I wish that were true of everybody, but I know women have a very different experience in the workforce, and so I've been very supportive to see some of these changes.
Thank you, Joe Radinovich. Kirsten Kennedy?
Sex trafficking. It's all of our responsibility, and it even happened in North Branch, Minnesota. We had a massage parlor open up, which we thought was a massage parlor, and a person who owned the business next door called me and said, "Mayor, I think we have something shady going on." So I called my police chief and said, well, either you go in or I'm going to send in my 18-year-old son with a GoPro on his head. He said, we'll take care of it, Kirsten, don't do anything about it. They had taken their passports, they had brought people into the United States, not in a legal manner, and then removed their passports. Human trafficking is like any trafficking. It should not happen. Once again, you talk about immigration, this is part of it. This is about getting it right. I was up recently at the Minnesota State Capitol to advocate for the Equal Rights Amendment for Women, the ERA. Guess what? I was shocked to know that Minnesota is still sitting on it. We haven't passed it. How can that be? I am 54 years old and I don't have equal rights as a woman? You've got to be kidding me. A mother of 5 kids, I have 2 daughters that don't have equal rights in America? Not okay. And as far as Me Too, I'm part of that. Me Too. And I'm going to say it right now. It should happen to no one. It should be stopped. And I know as soon as men hear it's a women's issue, we kind of shut off our ears. It's not a women's issue. This is a men's issue, and men need to start standing up and saying no more. So this is what I'm going to say today. It stops with me. It stops in my home, it stops in my community, it stops in my state, and it needs to stop in the United States of America. And I do not want anyone to lose their job. What I want is for it to stop. And no woman, no child to ever have to go through that.
Thank you, Kirsten Kennedy. On the issue of the hashtag #MeToo movement, Michelle Lee, as a Congress member, it's going to affect what happens in the legislature, in the Congress in the next couple of years. Where do you stand?
Women's rights are human rights. And the Me Too movement is perhaps one of the best things that has ever happened. Women came out, they told their truth, and for the first time, they were believed. As far as the sex trafficking, it's not just women from foreign countries being brought into America, it's women in Duluth, whether they're going on the boats. I remember 20, 30, 40 years ago and covering this, and someone came to me and said, women are being brought to the boats, the ore boats in our harbor for sexual favors. And I went to the local police department and they said, that's not happening here. It doesn't happen in Duluth. And I kept asking and kept asking and I kept hearing no, no, no. And now we know that those things have happened. The Native American women have come forward and there have been studies that tell their stories. The thing is, we have to start treating women and our children better. They all have value. Every human being has value. And when we hear someone saying that they're a victim, we have to say, tell us your story. And we have to offer them a believability that they know that they are being listened to and that we hear their truth. Duluth is doing it right. We no longer treat prostitution or people who are in the sex trade, young girls, as criminals. We're treating these people as victims. We're getting them into housing. We're providing them with clothing and food. We're helping them become educated. We're breaking that cycle. And that's what we need to do not only in Minnesota, we need to do that throughout America. We have to listen to women and hear their truths.
Thank you, Michelle Lee. Leah Phifer, the Me Too movement.
Yeah, and just to get back to your question too about human trafficking and sex trafficking, that was one of the foremost areas that I worked on when I was at Immigration Customs Enforcement, was securing T visas, which is the type of visa that allows victims of trafficking to legally seek recourse and remain in the United States. So one of the steps that I would first take in Congress is to immediately secure additional funding for the Violence Against Women Act, which is the act that funds the T visas so that we can expand them to the level that they need to be at. Right now, we only have T visas available for 1 in approximately every 5 victims of trafficking. And I would also caution to say that when we're talking about trafficking that primarily affects women, we need to go beyond just sex trafficking, but also labor trafficking. Far too many women are caught up in areas where they're not being paid anything for their labor. We also need to be talking about, as you mentioned, the Me Too movement and passing just laws for women who can seek recourse for having been harassed in the workplace. And one of the best ways that we can get those laws on the books is to start by electing more women to every level of government.
Thank you. I think that was applause. All right, let's try to hold that if we can. Jason Metsa, Me Too, sex trafficking. As a Congress member, what's your agenda?
People deserve dignity wherever they live or work. And both women and people of color have been taken advantage of in this country for way too long. And it's time that it stops now. It's why when I worked with the Northeast Area Labor Council as a union organizer, we partnered in Duluth with a group called Men Against Trafficking. We have to acknowledge who's requesting those services and put an end to it by bringing awareness to the issue. And there's a lot more work to do left on those issues, especially for our disenfranchised communities. In regard to women's issues, women need to be treated fairly wherever they are. I've got a young son at home. We're planning on having more kids, and I could very well end up with a daughter. And I definitely want to make sure that we level the playing field for her and make sure that in Washington, we take a few steps like we did here in St. Paul with the Women's Economic Security Act, the ERA legislation you heard referred to tonight, and making sure that you get the same paycheck for the same work as you're doing with your counterparts. And we need to hold companies accountable by auditing them and making sure that those things are happening so there aren't discrimination in your pay and in your vacation benefits. I think that people need to make sure that they're electing someone who's got a good voting record on the women's right to choose. And I've got a 100% record on that, fighting for other women's issues. And I want to make sure that if I'm elected in Washington, that we level the playing field for women and people of color so that their lives can be better and more like mine.
Thank you, Jason Metsa. Do you think Al Franken should have resigned?
Yes.
Joe Radinovich, do you think Al Franken should have resigned?
I think he should have let the ethics process play out.
Kirsten Kennedy, do you think Al Franken should have resigned?
No, I do not.
Michelle Lee,
I have to agree with him. No, he should not have, and I think the process should allow him to have due process.
Leah Phifer,
I was glad to see that he made that personal decision on his own, but I would have liked to see a due process set the standard.
thank you. If it was up to you, would you have fired him?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Kirsten Kennedy, I want to move on to a real fun topic. You know, we made a good start with Obamacare. Sure, it was somewhat troubled, but we made a good start. All that was wiped out as soon as the GOP took over Congress, essentially. Healthcare, though, is still a huge issue for most people. And Congress is going to be dealing with healthcare issues. Where does Kirsten Kennedy stand as a Congressman?
Well, I've said this often in rooms like this, and I'm going to say it now. I would love to wake up tomorrow in the United States of America and have Medicare for all, a single-payer system. We're not going to get there overnight. So we're going to have to take steps and make commitments to doing it. 1 inch at a time, whatever it is, we don't stop. We need to, I'm sorry, I keep messing it, it must be me. We need to start focusing on eliminating waste and focusing on the patient care. We need to ensure all Americans, I must just break them. We need to ensure all Americans have access to health care. Right now in the United States of America, over 60% of bankruptcies are due to medical issues. That is not who we are as a country, and I would argue that that is not going to help us build from our middle class out. We need to stop forcing people to bargain for higher wages or health coverage. We need to stop health care from being something that people are forced to live without.
and then remain in the shadows. We need to stop making it so that people who have worked their entire lives don't have to go and get food from centers because they can't afford to get their medication or decide on if they're going to pay a bill. We need a system that prioritizes the health of working class families over profits for insurance companies, and I will sit with anyone and negotiate with anyone that will take us towards that.
So you're saying that you're in favor of single-payer health care system?
If all my dreams were going to come true today, absolutely. We're not there yet.
Just in case some people weren't listening.
Okay.
Michelle Lee, the question on health care, where do you stand if you're elected to Congress?
Right now, we have people in the 8th District, in Moose Lake, in Carlton, here in Cloquet, that are more afraid of going to their mailbox to get their medical bill than they are of coming down with a medical illness. As Kirsten said, medical bills are the #1 reason people are going bankrupt. Healthcare is a human right. I support single payer. I support Medicare for all. I support any plan that will allow people to buy on the open market a buy-in to Medicare. This is important. This is something that we all need to be working towards. It may not happen tomorrow, but I sure would like to have it happen very, very soon. I've heard so many stories on the campaign trail. I talked to a man whose daughter is considering being a medical refugee. She just came down with type 1 diabetes. She's afraid that she won't be able to afford medical care, and she is now considering taking her skills and leaving America to go to another country that offers universal health. It's so frustrating because we hear so many things. Obamacare was going to be the solution. Well, the powers that be let Obamacare wither and die on the vine. We have to have single payer. We have to make sure that our hospitals in rural areas are being reimbursed at an adequate rate, so we don't have a two-tier healthcare system where you get good care if you're down in Minneapolis or mediocre care whether you're in Moose Lake or in Duluth. So we have to all come together, figure this out, and that's going to take people, Republicans, Democrats, and independents in Washington to come together and say, we can do this. And I know that, again, there's a lot of lawmakers, no matter California. This is a thing that we have to solve as a nation, and we have to solve it soon.
Thank you, Michelle Lee. The issue to you, Leah Phifer, is how are you going to fix health care?
We cannot wait to fix healthcare. We cannot wait to fix our healthcare system. We can pass a Medicare for All bill in the next 3 years. We will take back the House in November of 2018. We will take back the Senate in 2020 and the White House. And by January of 2021, we will have a Medicare for All Act passed and implemented within the next 2 years. I am honored to have received the Our Revolution Duluth and Minnesota endorsements for my strong support of a Medicare for All system in this country. I know it can be done. We do not have to wait, and we do not have to compromise. Compromises with the Republicans is what got us the ACA in its current form. We compromised and we did not allow a public option to be added to the Affordable Care Act. And now we have Minnesotans and Americans across the country who earn too much to qualify for a government subsidy, but after student loans and a mortgage payment and daycare expenses, they don't have enough left at the end of the month to pay their ACA premium. That is simply not acceptable in this country, and the only thing that will ensure truly universal health care is a Medicare for All Act that I know we can pass and implement in the next 3 years.
Thank you, Leah Phifer. Jason Metsa, where do you stand on health care?
Healthcare is a human right, and it's a damn shame that people have to choose between paying their medical bills and paying the light bill. We need to make sure that people aren't doing that from now on. And in Congress, it's why I'll work to pass a single-payer healthcare bill to make sure that whether you live in Edina or Wadena, carry a lunch pail to work or a briefcase, that you have access to the care that you deserve, and there should be no cost to it. we should be making sure that that happens for you. And if elected, I will work to that end.
Thank you, Jason. Metsa. Joe Radinovich, your stand on healthcare?
Yeah, well, I think healthcare is a human right, and I think we have a broken system. But before I go any further on that, I do want to actually point out that it wasn't compromises with Republicans that created the ACA. It was actually compromises with Democrats. We had a veto-proof majority in the Senate. It was Max Baucus, the Democrat from Montana, on the Finance Committee who actually undermined the public option. So we should have been able to get that through back then. We need to strengthen our resolve. We need to do that when we have the opportunity. But it was compromises with Democrats that led us to the situation that we have right now. The system that we have in this country right now is broken. And as an example of how broken it is, I tell the story of my two dads. I have a stepdad and I have a dad, and they're both electricians. They actually both graduated from Crosby in 1977. You could say my mother had a type. So they were, one was a union electrician, the other one's a self-employed electrician working on residential projects mostly. And the impact that our system has had is that my dad always had really good health care. When I needed it most, when my brother needed it most, we always had access to the doctor, the care. We could go to HCMC when we needed it. We could go to Crosby. We could go anywhere we wanted and get the care we needed. My stepdad one time had a self-pay premium that was very insufficient. And so I remember one time we were splitting wood and he cut his thumb right from about here to here, and he just taped it together and hoped that it would heal properly. One time he was lifting a cement bag off the back of the truck and he dislocated the tendons in his shoulder and his elbow. And you know what he did? He went to work the next day with a shooting stick propped up under his arm so he could turn a wrench just like this. These are the decisions that working people are having to make. Universal single-payer health care would be a benefit to people negotiating contracts. It would be a benefit to the self-employed. It would be a benefit to small business people because it simplifies our system and it takes the middlemen out. It's the middlemen that are making the profits that should be dedicated to care. Medicare has about a 2% overhead rate. Right now, private insurers are upwards of 15%. That's care that's being spent on advertising and CEO bonuses. That's care that's not going where it needs to be going. And that's why this is so important. And that's why the next time we take the majority, we can't afford to be bargaining against ourselves.
Thank you, Joe Radinovich. The next question, hold on if you don't mind. Michelle Lee, I want to ask you as a journalist, I'm assuming the First Amendment is somewhat important to you. The people are talking about the Citizens United decision as a travesty, and the idea that corporations are people has been around forever. But what that decision said is that they can spend as much money corporations can on political speech as much as they want. So, as a member of Congress, what's your plan? What's your agenda when it comes to the Citizens United decision?
We need publicly funded campaigns, publicly funded elections. All of the panelists here, we spend a lot of our time raising money to win your vote. There's something definitely wrong with that. We should be out speaking to you, learning about the issues that really resonate in your heart, figuring out ways to serve you as your representative. Instead, we are hiring consultants who are telling us how to raise money, and it's broken. And because organizations like the NRA can come after us because we don't agree with their stand on military assault style weapons, they can come after us. They can throw in $2 million in advertising to shoot any one of us, any one of these campaigns down. We have to get the money out of politics. It has to get back to the very basics. One person, one vote.
Thank you, Michelle Lee. Leah Phifer, your issue on Citizens United and money in politics?
This is probably the most pervasive issue that we are facing right now because it affects absolutely every aspect of our lives when our representatives are bought and paid for by special interest groups like the NRA. What we have in front of us is not a mystery. This is not unsolvable. In fact, there are 3 pieces of legislation that I would immediately begin to advance when I get to Congress. The first is the Democracy Now! Act, which immediately would move to add a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. The second is called Fair Elections Now! Fair Elections Now! Would create a partially publicly funded finance system by matching small donations in a 6-to-1 ratio. So for every dollar of a small donation that you get under $250 or $500 would be matched with $6 from a federally funded coffer. So we can keep small donors and our voices in the process, incentivize small donors to have a place in the process while making sure we are not beholden to the large special interest groups that currently dominate our country. Lastly, we have a We the People's Act. A We the People's Act also sets a publicly funded matching system, and it restricts candidates from receiving any money from lobbyists or super PACs or PACs. So we need to immediately advance those 3 existing pieces of legislation that are languishing without so much as a hearing, so we don't continue to treat this problem as intractable. It is absolutely solvable, and there are 3 pieces of legislation pending right now.
Thank you, Leah Phifer. Jason Metsa?
Well, the last time I went to U.S. Bank to make a deposit, the bank didn't say, "Hey, Jason, how are you doing?" But my teller sure did. And I don't think that we should have special interests like we saw in Washington, essentially rewriting our history of where we moved forward from in 2008 to today. We went through one of the largest exchanges of wealth. Our tax dollars bailed out companies. It's why in the legislature I voted to take dark money out of politics and make sure that we actually hold one another accountable. And the only way we can do that is to pass laws that actually set up the U.S. Supreme Court to reverse that decision. People are people. Businesses are not people. It is that simple, and we need to have that kind of mentality in Washington, D.C. It's unfortunate that we don't, and if I'm elected, I'll work to pass a multitude of laws so that we can put up some common sense ideas to reverse that decision.
Thank you, Jason Metsa. Joe Radinovich on the issue of money in politics and Citizens United.
Well, I've been at the receiving end of more money in politics, I think, than probably most people on this panel, if not all people. I've had a habit, a bad habit, you could say, of being in pretty close elections. And so when I ran in 2012, it was one of the most contested legislative seats in the state. The same was true in 2014. And what we saw was an influx of dollars from across the state, from across the country, aimed at people like me in little old Crosby, Arrington, Minnesota, because we were advocating for solutions for the entire public. And the race that we had in 2014, a legislative race, ended up costing a total of over $750,000. Imagine that. That was over like 45 mailers. By the time all those mailers came in, I was a little bit worried that my parents weren't going to vote for me at the end of that, but they stuck with me. And then in 2016, Congressman Nolan was, when I was his manager, in the most expensive congressional race of all time. Now, there's a distinction that I think is important here. He raised $3 million. Stuart Mills raised $3 million. It didn't take him quite as long to raise his $3 million. But so that was a total of $6 million. The race cost $30 million. $24 million. 4 times what was spent was raised by PACs and independent expenditure groups and aimed at the people of the 8th district. I mean, think about the impact that has. These are people who are unaccountable to folks here in the district. They have an agenda, and they've been playing in elections like this across the country. There are only a handful of competitive elections because of gerrymandering and other things. It's time we have a move to amend to lay out how we have elections in this country that are serving the interests of the people and not those with the most money.
Thank you, Joe Radinovich. Kirsten Kennedy, your issue on Citizens United and money in politics.
Get it out. That's what we need to do. Get out money in politics. I think it's all of our responsibility. I know we've had multiple candidates up here who have signed on to end Citizens United, but as you know, that's not going to be done by elected officials. That's going to be done by the courts. So what can we do until then? What we can do is the SEC can regulate and require publicly traded companies to disclose their political spending. We can work on grassroots and public funding of elections, and hey, if you want to spend your public funds to go after the other candidate, go for it. We should have shorter election cycles. Right now in Washington, D.C., our elected officials take a few hours out of every day, they go across the street to a phone calling center and raise funds. We're not paying them to fundraise. We're paying them to govern. Get politics out. We need to recognize that corporations are not people, that we need accountability and transparency and campaign finance reform. Those are the steps we can take. We also need to move to amend the Constitution of the United States to establish that money is not speech and that human beings, not corporations, are persons entitled to constitutional rights. I also agree with the Anti-Corruption Act. I'll go on record for the Anti-Corruption Act. It doesn't take rocket science to recognize that right now in the United States of America, we're having a problem governing because corporations are behind the scenes directing their elected officials on how to vote and what legislation to bring through. It will stop. We get it out now.
Thank you, Kirsten Kennedy. I'm wondering if we can all agree on one thing. Take a break for about 10 minutes, and we'll come back. We've got a lot more questions.
What do you think about what the candidates said about the gun issue?
Well, I'm certainly happy to hear that they're all in favor of doing at least universal background checks, but I think we need to go further than that. I would like to see limitations on assault-style rifles. I would like to see ammunition magazines lowered, the number of bullets allowed. Certainly the research, the CDC research is a big issue that we aren't allowing now, and that was mentioned up here. I think we've come a long way as a party. Actually, I've been watching the Democratic Party evolve on this issue, and it's taken a long time for people to get to the idea that you can be a gun owner, you can be a hunter, and you can still be in favor of universal background checks and other common sense gun measures.
Thank you, Joan.
You're welcome.
Well, if we change the House and the Senate, what's one? I think so. At least you have a plan versus saying,
Interesting.
oh, we don't like this. He's got it, and then nothing else. Hey, Carol, your arm. What's up, Tanner? You got a plan? Check. think. A couple weeks ago, we went to Sedona to take a mountain biking class. And at the very end of it, I was riding, the class had concluded, and I was going back, but I'd gotten a thorn in my front tire, and I was moving there real slowly, and I came through the corner kind of hard, and the front tire just washed out. Is there? I thought you were going to slip on ice if they allowed that. Put her on a flat floor with carpeting, that's just... For you?
I walked in office. And then I was at ER, I was back in, and here's the whole room.
Whoa.
It took like 4 hours because they got it all the steps. And once they put it in there, it came up with
Why do you have to do a bunch of tests? Just put it in and do the test after.
the doctor looked at it and he says, I can see it's from the outside.
Yeah.
But they have to do it in they have to do it in every time they do talk about the meeting guy, they come okay if there's a chip on the road, so every time that takes another half hour.
Big event.
Did you end up going in that? Doesn't sound like a very fun day at all. Take more x-rays. Do more. That don't have that much to do. I mean, I guess they have some, but not.
Candidates?
I think she's calling the candidates.
Down there.
I think he's calling. Well, can you?
So you Steve, step down there where I can get you right. So you're Steve Wilson
from Tower,
Steve,
Minnesota.
Tower, and you drove all the way down to Cloquet for this. How long did it take you to get here?
It was about an hour and a half. Well worth it though. I mean, I have to say all the candidates are impressive.
Is there an issue that particularly got you to be here? Are you a delegate? Are you involved in the party?
I am a delegate to the Congressional District Convention coming up. And so I wanted to, I knew a lot about Leah Phifer, who I've been supporting, but I wanted to learn
Candidates, let's start
about the
part
other
two.
candidates as well. And I still love Leah Phifer. She's confirmed what I already knew about her, which is that she's a policy woman, which a lot of people don't go for, but she's incredibly knowledgeable about the issues and very thoughtful. It's obvious she spent a lot of time investigating, researching, and coming up with solutions that are going to work. There's not a lot of rhetoric that comes out of her. It's actually solid information, solid plans, and I've been waiting for a Democrat. I've lived in the 8th Congressional District since I was 21, and I'm 67 years old now. And all those years I've been waiting for a progressive Democrat congressional candidate who is strong on the environment. We've never had one. And she's balanced. She comes from a mining family. I worked in the mines. I worked driving a logging truck. We have similar perspectives. We can see both sides of the issues. We're not knee-jerk, just in the direction that a lot of our other representatives have been. She's very thoughtful on that issue, which I appreciate.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
So, would one of you like to talk to people and talk about your experience coming here tonight? Come on up, Brad. Byron? Come on up.
And you can edit that out.
Just for a minute or two, huh?
Sure. Byron, what got you to come here? Where are you from?
I'm living in Moose Lake, and I came here tonight because I'm familiar with some of the candidates, and some of the candidates I wasn't familiar with, and I wanted to hear in their own words where they stood on the issues.
And what have you heard that most impressed you or struck a chord with you?
I'd heard Leah Phifer before. I've been real impressed with her with the detail of knowledge that they know. Radinovich, same thing. A lot of them, I think they're pretty similar on all the issues so far, but I'm just impressed, especially with those two, with the detail of knowledge that they brought with them. Partly because of their backgrounds. They were held positions where they worked with a lot of these issues, or at least in a position to get real knowledgeable and informed.
Thanks. Would you like to talk about it? Okay. Thanks so much.
Looking forward to part 2. Custer.
Custer, thank you.
Okay.
I'll just get the chair.
That's what we're thinking. Okay.
interview you about being here tonight. Would that be okay?
Sure.
All right.
Oh, you're,
Here we go. So, what is your name, sir?
my name is John Fisher Merritt.
Well, it's good to see you. I've seen you over the years at the co-op. I know
The
you're
second half of our forum will
I'm
start
a farmer,
in
yep.
1 minute.
I'm a semi-retired farmer. My son is now a main farmer.
So, how long did you travel to get here today? About 20 minutes?
Yeah.
And anything strike you as really interesting about this tonight? Do you know the candidates, or do you have a favorite, or is there an issue that got you most?
I do have a favorite. Leah Phifer is my favorite. I think we need a young person and preferably a woman in this as our legislator. And she is on the ball and she's full of fire, and I think she's going to make a wonderful congressperson.
What do you think about when it comes to farm issues? I know that as a farmer, you're pretty clear about issues like drain tiles and waste that comes off of farms. Are you looking to have that improve the laws on how farms affect water improve?
Well, being an organic farmer, we don't really do any pollution. Actually, we installed a dam to catch runoff off of our fields to prevent polluting the Nemadji River. And so, you know, we're completely happy with the way our organic system is working. I'm not sure, you know, I know that there's a lot of agricultural pollution, and I think the worst agricultural pollution is from runoff from nitrogen fertilizers. Lots of wells in greater Minnesota and the down in farm country are polluted with nitrates.
Looks like it's going to start up again.
Okay.
Folks, thanks for sticking around for the second half. I'd like to remind you again to try to keep the applause to a non-existent level. And the heckling you've done pretty good at. The only people that have heckled so far has been me. I'm a lawyer, I can take it. Yeah, maybe. That's right. Well, candidates, again, thanks for coming back to the second half of our forum tonight. As you know, this is being taped as an episode of Harry's Gang. I'm Pete Radinovich. I'm moderating Harry's Gang in this forum. And I don't remember if I mentioned this earlier, but I've told most of you that no one has ever been elected to Congress from the 8th Congressional District without first being on Harry's Gang. That is a fact. So, good luck to all of you, I guess. Well, we have a stack of questions. What we've done is gone through a lot of these and sort of consolidated them so that you can touch on the issues. This is not the first time most of you candidates have answered these questions. This is the first time you've answered them in this forum and in this group. But I have to tell you, and we're going to start on the left again with Leah Phifer, that one of the biggest issues that's affecting our party and our endorsement is the mining issue. And there's a divide between the pro-labor union mining people and the environmentalists who are fearful that mining is going to damage our water and ecosystem. And that's causing great problems in our party, and I think people are going to vote on that issue much more than any other single issue on the left-leaning side of the spectrum. So, Leah Phifer, the question to you is, where do you stand on the mining and environmental issue?
Copper nickel mining, I believe, is what we're discussing here today. I just want to reiterate, as I mentioned earlier when we started, that I come from 4 generations of men who worked in the taconite mining industry, in the iron ore industry. And I am very aware that the mining industry has put food on the tables of families throughout the Iron Range and Minnesota for generations, just like it has done for mine. I fully fully intend to support our taconite mining industry, try to stabilize the industry so that families like mine aren't constantly living under the threat of layoffs, and maybe looking into riskier jobs and projects such as what Pete is talking about. The Polymet Twin Metals projects, copper nickel mining in general, is a type of mining that has never been done in Minnesota before. It is very, very different from iron ore mining, and it is very, very risky in a water-rich environment like we have here. This was one of the driving issues that drove me to declare early in October for this race. I was very troubled and remain very troubled over legislators using their power to push forward these projects through the Polymet Land Swap Bill and through the Miner Act, which I'm strongly opposed to. We cannot and should not be using our legislative power to circumvent due process and push forward these mining projects. I am not sure there is any amount of financial assurances that we can possibly demand a company put forward that could ever make me completely comfortable with these projects. Thank you, Pete.
Thank you, Leah Phifer. Jason Metsa, will you tell us your position on the environment versus mining?
I've always believed in stewardship and sustainability and making sure that, like my grandparents and parents did, we have the next generation getting something in good shape. Virginia, as an example, the city I live in, gets its water from a reclaimed mine pit. And that, to me, is an example of how we should be paying it forward to the next generation. And I'm proud of that. It's also why in my first term I authored a bill to create a 4-year water university research center right up on the Iron Range. It would have been an extension of the University of Minnesota so that we could come up with the next technology so that we could focus on creating the tools that our kids need to do the next generation of mitigation research. It would create good jobs building the building. It would bring some of the best and brightest scientists from around the world to make sure that we are protecting our water. And when it comes to our projects, we need to support our state employees and making sure, our federal employees as well, but we need to support the work they do as public servants, just like I do in St. Paul. And they have recommended that these things can move forward, whether it's a family farm or a project up in my district that's controversial right now. We have to trust that their work is essentially what they have spent their fields and entire careers learning expertise in, and we need to trust their recommendations. If I'm elected to Congress, I'll work to make sure that we bring a water university research center to the Iron Range to come up with the next generation of mitigation technology so that our kids have the opportunity to do things better than us.
Thank you, Jason Metsa. Joe Radinovich, what's your congressional take on the issue of mining on the Iron Range versus the environmental concerns that often come with it?
Right, and I think that we're given a false choice between jobs and the environment too often, and I think that's a wedge designed to drive into our party and to make it more difficult for us to win in places like this. I believe that we should move aggressively away from fossil fuels. In order to do that, we should incentivize clean technologies, we should increase the regulation of carbon emissions, and we should increase those renewable energy standards. Now, paradoxically, what happens is that we move away from fossil fuels, and the clean technologies that we rely on increasingly need precious metals, things like copper, nickel, and cobalt for batteries. Where those materials are necessary, we have to have a clear process in place that's transparent, that holds the companies accountable, that makes sure that we hold a high standard where other resources are at play, and we need to make sure that financial assurances are set aside to ensure that proper closure of the mine can be done after the life of the project and potentially after the life of the company. Those resources should be bankruptcy proof. We should not approve any project that can't be done safely. But I think that this race is about more than one issue, and it's about more than one region. We have a changing economy in front of us, and that change is creating a lot of anxiety in the people across this district, and that's what makes these issues so difficult. And if we, as a Democratic Party, are going to offer solutions for working people, then we need to win in difficult places like this. In 2016, Donald Trump won this district by 15 points. Congressman Nolan, whose position is widely known on my name here, won this district by less than 1 point. I know that there's a consensus on this issue among the Democratic caucus goers and attendees, convention attendees, but once we step out into the broader electorate, the opinion is much different. And we have to be able to unify our Democratic base with enough independents to win this race, or we won't be able to advocate for environmental protections or progress for anybody.
Thank you, Joe. Kirsten Kennedy, the issue is jobs and environment. It seems to be dividing our party in some ways. And as a member of Congress, where are you going to stand?
Well, here's where I'm going to stand. First of all, I'd like to say no candidate on the stage has the ability nor the authority to promise mining projects will not move forward. That is disingenuous. Minnesota has a long tradition of mining. I am from the South, so I am not part of the Iron Range nor the mining communities, but I believe we have a responsibility to get the mining right. And what I mean by that is we want to move towards a green economy. We want to use our cell phones, wind turbines. I spoke about North Branch and our solar, and we want to use technologies to move us there. We need minerals. And the minerals that we are looking for are found in Minnesota on the Iron Range. I understand also that people say you cannot be an environmentalist and pro-mining. I think that is not mutually exclusive, and I think that's also disingenuous. I am pro-environment. My brother-in-law is a climate change scientist, and he's here tonight, and he can speak to the issue if you'd like to speak to him afterwards. But it can be done. We have a responsibility for it to be done, because I am unwilling to put it on countries, third world countries, where there are no protections for the workers and no safety measures in place. We can do that. We can do that through the processes going on, and in the state right now, the permitting process, we can look at the language in that permitting process. If companies say they will use the best practices, it has to be in the permit. If it's not in the permit, it's not going to get done. Let's look at the permitting going on right now and add our voices to that and our support for that. Frankly, while this seems to be a divisive issue, I think it's a little bit of a red herring. We need jobs, we want a green economy, we need to get it from a place where right here in Minnesota we can get it and do it right. I am not taking food off of people's tables. It's not happening from this candidate. I think we can talk about the critical metals we need and what they go into. They go into medical technology, and they go into providing catalytic converters and pacemakers and solar projects. Let's do it here so that we don't have to get 40 to 90% of our products from countries that are third world with no protections and no safety. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten Kennedy. Michelle Lee, do you think there is a division between the environmentalists and the mining, pro-mining people in this party? And regardless, if you're elected to Congress, where are you going to stand on those issues?
Well, I will address the mining issue, which really sucks the air out of every room that these candidates and myself have appeared in. I came out early. I did not attempt to thread the needle. I support iron ore mining. I support taconite mining. I also support unions and collective bargaining. But I am not convinced that we can do copper nickel mining in a rich, water-rich environment. I believe that this issue will end up in the courts. It's going to go all the way up to the Supreme Court, and chances are pretty darn good that it will pass, because we have a Republican president who is now stacking or attempting to stack our Supreme Court. If this does become a reality, I will be a thorn in the side of these companies. I will be the bear that has been poked. I will fight to ensure that they live up to everything that they say in their proposals. But let's take a look at those proposals. It's scary. Yes, these are strategic minerals, but I believe we need to keep those in the ground until we absolutely need them. People say, but they're going to do it in other countries where the regulations aren't as strong. Folks, two wrongs do not make a right. I am so afraid that we haven't studied. Our medical community has come out 30,000 strong. Our doctors and nurses say, where are the health impact study on this plan that could possibly pollute our water sources? How many people in this room have a water well at home? How many people are in the watershed of the Lake Superior watershed? These are questions that we should be included on, and we should voice our concern. This may be resolved by the time any one of us here is elected, but it's up to you to stand up and say, I'm concerned about this. Have we done everything possible? As it's been said in Washington before, there are knowns and there are unknowns. The things they decided 15 years ago, there's new science in place. Are we utilizing that science to make sure that we can move ahead? Because at the end of the day, water is life. Water is our most strategic national resource. And if you don't believe that, go out west, where mining has destroyed 40% of the water in some communities.
Thank you, Michelle Lee. That was the most unequivocal answer I think we've gotten on any issue so far tonight. Well, and I'm going to move on. I do appreciate that it is a big issue, obviously, and I'm fascinated to see how it's all going to turn out in the electorate. But the next question goes to Jason Metsa, and this is about the family farms. And one of you panelists mentioned earlier that this is a regional position. There are not a lot of farms in our district. Mining does have a big impact economically, but we do have farms in the southern part of the district. And as part of the Minnesota contingency, farming is very important. So my question is, where you stand, what's your position as a Congress member on farming in America?
Family farms built this country. My grandparents homesteaded in Angora and were able to make a living off the land. And a few generations put me at this table here today. And so farming is of the utmost importance. In fact, we have a thriving farming industry in the western part of the district, in the southern part of the district. In my part of the district, we farm rocks. A little bit different. I suggest not eating them. But we need to be investing in making sure that we have a more sustainable agricultural market and that farmers can get their food on our tables locally here and reduce the footprint that's needed to get that food on our tables, in our schools, in our hospitals, because it's the responsible thing to do. If I'm elected in Washington, I'll make sure that we put the resources out there to make sure the USDA centers and processes and funding needed are there to help those farmers do that.
Thank you, Jason. That's Joe Radinovich. Where do you stand on farming as part of the Minnesota contingent in Congress?
Greg, can you hear me right now? I'm just making sure that we've got a working microphone. Perfect. So, I think that when people think about farming in America, we probably think largely about those like a single farmhouse on a few hundred acres and a tractor and some cows and all that other stuff. But I think if you looked at the federal agricultural budget, you'd be dismayed to learn the type of things that subsidizes. Now, there are some important programs in there, but I think what we need to do is empower people who are farming locally across this region and across the country by making sure that some of that farm subsidy bill goes to those local farmers. I talked to a man in Duluth the other day who's doing urban agriculture. We know the importance of our food systems and sourcing things locally and making sure that we have a sustainable and healthy diet and access to those goods and materials. And so I'd like to see some revisions in the federal farm budget to make sure that we recognize that type of farming is important. I grew up in the southern part of this district. Again, it's a big district with diverse economies. And my grandparents actually did farm. They were cattle farmers. My mom, she didn't go into farming. She was kind of bleeding heart. One day she was out at the farm and a calf was born and the mother died. And so we ended up taking home a calf and raising it. As it grew, it thought it was a dog. We had 4 dogs and it would run down to meet us at the bus. I think that really what we need to make sure that we're doing is recognizing that this economy in this district is diverse and it accounts for a lot of different things. One more thing I would say about farming is that, as we have this discussion about tariffs, an issue that I know is important on the Iron Range and that impacts steel because there have been steel cheaters and steel cheating nations over the last several years that have been taking advantage of trade laws, and we haven't been cracking down effectively enough on that. But this a mass approach to tariffs obviously is having an impact on farmers, especially pork farmers and soybean farmers in the southern part of this district, across the state and across this region. So we need to make sure that we're advocating for all industries and all economies in this area.
Thank you, Joe Radinovich. Kirsten Kennedy, you want to tell us your stand on farming if you're elected to Congress?
I do. I think right now Minnesota farms are having a hard time. We're stepping into a trade war. And frankly, as was mentioned earlier, we've already seen tariffs on pork, fruit, nuts and other items, and now we're moving into soybeans, corn, and beef. It is hurting our family farms in Minnesota, and we have to be mindful of protecting them and making sure that they can sell their products on the open market and not have to go into bankruptcy or debt or not be able to afford to move forward as family farms, leaving only the industrialized farms to bring products to market. We are working on sustainable products. We're working on runoff in our areas of farms, but I want to tell you right now, it's an economic crisis for our farmers. The people that are putting food on our table, and I have to tell you, farming is not pretty work. They're working morning to night. They have equipment issues. They have issues from getting the work done with their families. Families are not as large as they used to be. They don't have 10 and 12 kids to go out on the farm and work. And so I would look at what we're doing with our trade and look at ways we can support our farms in Minnesota rather than tearing them down. That's what I would do.
Thank you, Kirsten Kennedy. Michelle Lee, if you're elected to Congress, what are you going to do in the farming issues when they come up?
Well, I'm going to work really hard that we have a fair farm bill. But let me just go back in the 1980s when we had the first publicly discussed farm prices. I did a 5-part series on the dairy farmer here in Carleton County. We had dozens and dozens of dairy farms in this county. We had creameries. We had a company called Ampy where people could ship their milk up to Duluth. I ran into a lady, the granddaughter of one of those farmers in the Moose Lake Co-op, and she was saying that her dad's farm went to her 2 boys, and the struggles that these dairy farmers are under right now. They are forced to double and triple the cost of transporting their milk now to the Twin Cities for treatment. The wives or husbands are working outside. Some are having 2 other jobs besides their farming. They're struggling, folks. And now with these tariffs, with the retaliation that we're hearing now from China, where our pork farmers and our soybean farmers, they're not going to be ordering farm equipment that's produced right here in America. We have to get this right. Tariffs need to be done with a scalpel. They do not need to be done with a sledgehammer. We have to continue working across the lanes with our allies and with China, and we are a free trade. We're in a world trade right now. I mean, our pork is going to China, and China is now saying they're going to cut back on 20% of the pork that we export to them. You know what that's going to do to our pork farmers here in the 8th District and throughout Minnesota? It's going to be a crisis that we will never imagine. We have to start dealing and talking with these people and figuring out how we can make this a fair playing field for their products and our products. Because I don't want to see, we only have a handful of dairy farms left here in Carleton County. And are we going to see, we are Democratic farmer labor. Are we going to end up just being Democrat labor? We got to think about this. We got to think about how we can help farmers.
Thank you, Michelle Lee. Leah Phifer, as a member of Congress, how are you going to be addressing farming issues?
Agriculture is one of the most overlooked economic sectors in the 8th District. We often get so focused on mining or on infrastructure that we neglect to talk about our farmers. And as has been mentioned by other panelists here, our dairy farmers are being devastated. Soybean, pork. We are seeing the repercussions of what Vladimir Putin wanted all along, putting someone in our country that Donald Trump has farmers. And we need to make sure that we are implementing smart tariffs that do not pit us against one another here in the 8th District. I would also work to make sure that our farm bill, one of the greatest things that the federal government can do to support our farmers, I would work to make sure that we very intentionally seek out Native American voices to include in the writing of the farm bill. Because right now, Native American voices are being overlooked in every aspect of the farm bill, and they are disproportionately affected by what comes out of that bill.
Thank you, Leah Phifer. Joe Radinovich, the next question's to you, and I guess people want to know if you're elected to Congress, what committees are you going to seek to be on?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I've given a little bit of thought to it.
Well, I didn't come up with questions, someone here did, but it is a good
Someone out there
question.
is especially smart and inquisitive. And I think that, I've given a little bit of thought to this. It's traditional that the 8th District representative has sat on the Transportation Committee. And so I have some interest in that and for the infrastructure implications, the Port City of Duluth, our rural airports, and the trains and lanes that we'll be needing to build here in the 21st century. I also have some interest in agriculture, and in part because of the farming discussion that we also had, but in part because of its implications in rural development. I think that one of the most intriguing and important issues facing rural America right now has to do with, again, the changing economy and the impact that that's had not just on the people who are subject to the changing economy, but also on the infrastructure that's been subject to the changing economy. And so if you look at some of these cities across the 8th District that used to be larger, right, at a previous boom era or a different point in time, what's happened is that they have infrastructure laid out over large pieces of area, and they don't have a tax base that necessarily supports that infrastructure. And so we need to be looking, I think, into the 21st century about how we can have smart development that recognizes that we need to make sure that our programs incentivize sort of inward growth and density and the type of things that we know can give us a sustainable future that we can pay for. Because if we don't do that, then we're going to continue to run our resources low. And I want to say that I believe in a robust form of government, and I think I made that clear tonight when I talked about Social Security, Medicare, and all these other things. But I think that we have an obligation then to make sure that we have resources to spend on those programs and that we're not spending them building out unnecessary infrastructure that can't be supported by the tax base that's underneath it.
Kirsten Kennedy, if you're elected to Congress, what committees are you going to seek out?
Well, it's probably not going to happen in the first couple of years. I'll spend that building relationships. As we know, there is a top-down when you're elected in Washington, D.C., so you don't get to step in and have all your dreams come true. I am passionate about health and human services. I am passionate about transportation. It's something that affects us greatly in my region. We don't have enough of it. We don't have good public transportation, and it's an issue for moving people around for healthcare, for education, and for food. I also am a farm bill person, so agriculture is important. As many people forget, sometimes the Farm Bill also helps get SNAP and help people with food insecurity issues, and right now they're trying to remove that. That is something that helps my region greatly. We have a lot of kids that go to school hungry. Their meals that they get at school sometimes are their only meals, and SNAP is important for seniors, for families, for so many people. So those are the committees I would be interested in.
Thank you, Kirsten Kennedy. Michelle Lee, what committees are you going to let them put you on?
Well, I agree with Kirsten. It may not happen the first term, it could happen the second term, because people fight to get on these committees because they do hold a lot of power. Again, I would love to be on the Health and Human Services Committee and work toward that single-payer health care, ag, and as Kirsten was pointing out, the importance of the ag bill, the farm bill, to not only our farmers, but to the people who do utilize the food programs that come out of that. Also, transportation and infrastructure. As you all know, we send lawmakers year after year to Washington, and they're going to have these infrastructure projects, and we're going to rebuild America. We tend to do a lot more building in foreign countries. And my goal is to start working on these infrastructure projects and bring the money back from those foreign countries so we can rebuild our bridges, our crumbling roads, and maybe build out broadband. Can you imagine what if we could have broadband throughout this 8th district, what kind of jobs we can create? Our kids will be connected with the world, the educational resource that will provide. There are things that we can do, but it all starts with getting that money back into this country and getting an investment on our tax dollar. So,
thank you, Michelle Lee. Leah Phifer, if you're elected to Congress, what committees do you plan to seek membership on?
Well, my wish list would be as diverse as the 8th District is. It would start with the Agriculture Committee, because as I mentioned earlier, agriculture is one of the most overlooked economic drivers in the 8th District. It would also include the Appropriations Committee, not a super exciting, sexy committee, but incredibly important. And I always joke with my team that I wanted my campaign slogan to be, "Make government boring again." But they nixed that. So we just need to remember how important even the boring Appropriations Committee can be. And then the third committee that I would like to be on, and I would be uniquely positioned to be on, is the House Intelligence Committee. I am a former, having worked as an intelligence analyst at the FBI. And one of the things that drove me to leave the FBI was the day I watched President Trump stand in front of a wall of stars, reflecting my fellow fallen intelligence officers, and brag about his crowd sizes. So I would give my eye teeth to be on the House Intelligence Committee and finally lay bare for the American public what he has done.
Thank you, Leah Phifer. Jason Metsa, what committees do you want to be on if you're elected to Congress?
I'll keep it simple for you all. Transportation and agriculture.
I like that, nice and simple. Well, I do want to point out before, we've got a lot more questions, but this whole forum was put on, what was my idea, to get all you guys on Harry's gang. And when Patty Murdo asked Justin Purpich about it, he took the reins and he organized this whole event. Linda Radetsky, keep mispronouncing her name, she's the vice chair of the 8th Congressional District DFL Committee. Dan Reed is the chair of the 11A DFL. Patty Murdo is the vice chair. Virg Borglund is on the Civility Project, and he's making sure that people don't block and keeping you guys time. And Eric Lippinen, who's a superstar in my world, runs Cat 7 and produces Harry's Game. So those are the people that put this event on tonight. Imaginary Verge hasn't put up a stop sign. Interesting.
He puts it up, but people don't pay attention.
That must be it. So let's see now. I think our next question goes to Kirsten. And this is climate change. Now, you talked about your brother-in-law being an expert. I'm dying to meet him and ask him about it. We have believers and non-believers, and we have a Congress that is full of people who believe the non-believers and people who believe the non-believers. As a member of Congress, what are you going to do to work on climate change as a Congress member?
Well, first, I think we need to make clear that climate change is real. And we need to make sure that the language that climate change is real is put back in at the federal level. And we need to be honest that the last 10 years have been the warmest years in recorded history in the past century. And if you ask my brother-in-law, Aaron, one of the things he talks about is we need to get off fossil fuels. Now, I would love to say tomorrow we're off of fossil fuels. That's not the case. To get to a green economy, that means we have to transition from fossil fuels to natural gas and to eventually zero emissions. And how we do that? We have so much potential in solar, wind, wave, tidal, and ocean. And those are the things that we can move towards as a country and follow places that are doing it. But the first step is recognizing that climate change is real.
Thank you, Kirsten Kennedy. Michelle Lee, climate change, an issue in Congress. It's being debated and talked about and will be if you're elected. Where do you stand?
Well, I also say climate change is real. If anybody that lived through these past 100-year rains that seem to be happening every 25 years, you know something is going on. We have to address our use of carbon fuels, and I look at the things that we should be doing more of, and that's capturing solar energy, expanding our use of hydroelectricity and wind. If you take any drive out anywhere between Minnesota and out west, you can see those big wind turbines and how that is helping to fuel the electricity of the communities. And I think, why aren't we building those here on the Iron Range? Why aren't we building those turbines in Minnesota? Why aren't we expanding our efforts to create the jobs that will build those solar-powered panels that can really help reduce that? But we really have to come to the table and figure out, yes, climate change is real, and we got to really put our money where our mouth is. And that means that we're going to have to start supporting these energy sources that will help us.
Thank you, Michelle Lee. Leah Phifer, your take on climate change?
The first thing that I would immediately do is reinstate climate change on the list of national security priorities. One of the first things President Trump did when he came into office was to take climate change off of the list of national security threats. We need to immediately get it back on the list so that we can treat climate change with the same amount of resources and urgency that we treat terrorism and other national security threats. I would immediately seek out a Republican counterpart so that I could join the Climate Solutions Lobby, one of the most effective climate solution groups in Congress. And I would also work with my counterparts to pass legislation to finally implement a carbon fee and dividend program. We have a beautiful framework in place that is smart, will save us money, and will eventually maybe even reverse the effects of climate change in the country and around the world.
Thank you, Leah Phifer. Jason Metsa, if you're elected to Congress, where do you stand on climate change?
You know, it's our responsibility to make sure that the next generation has the tools and resources to do things a little better than we did. And it's why in St. Paul, in my first term, I worked on passing one of the largest solar incentive rebates in the nation. And it spurred an industry here, creating over 5,000 jobs in Minnesota over the last 5 or 6 years, and created manufacturing districts where we need them most, on the Iron Range, to diversify our local economy. We can be doing more of that right here. We can be making the wind and other renewable resource tools that we need right in this district if we're providing the incentives as a federal government. If I'm elected, I'll make sure that it's a priority of mine to make sure that we're harnessing that and bringing those technologies and manufacturing jobs here.
Thank you, Jason Metsa. Joe Radinovich, your stance on climate change, and what would you do if elected to Congress?
Well, I would echo a number of the things obviously that have been said by the panel so far. I think that it's good that we have people who are so firmly united in opposition to the harmful impact of global climate change. I think that one of the worst things that President Trump has done, I just about said President Bush, he had a long list of bad things too, but in this case, President Trump, one of the worst things that he did was undercut the Kyoto Accords. And I think that it's so important that we have finally gotten to this point globally where we had engaged in a conversation about worldwide standards that impact climate change. And then with it, the change of one presidency, we've undercut all that progress in Americans who are abroad in places where it really matters. And so I want to see a regulation on carbon emissions. I think that we need to be increasing renewable energy standards, and I think we need to be putting the resources behind those renewable energy standards that make sure that we can invest in the technologies to help us deal with this 21st century problem, because climate change is real.
Thank you, Joe Radinovich. Michelle Lee, the next question is on the budget. Now, we recently passed the tax cut bill. I like to call it the Mitch McConnell tax cut bill because he had been sitting on that gem for 10 years before he found a chance to pass it. Had nothing to do with Donald Trump, but I'm editorializing. If you are elected to Congress, one of your main jobs is going to be working on the budget and the tax proposals. And I'd like to know where you stand, what you plan to do if you're elected to the 8th Congressional District.
Is there a question in there somewhere?
I'd like to know what you would do with the budget, what your position is on the budget and taxes if you're elected.
Okay, this recent tax bill that was passed and approved, it does nothing more than make the rich richer and build walls around our working poor. I have talked to many people who are upper middle class and rich who say, you know what, we did not need that tax cut. And I said, well, what are you going to do with that money? We're going to pass it down to our kids. Their kids who are now struggling because they can't find good paying jobs. So the money is trickling down, but we need to figure out a better way of trickling it down to our communities. So I would do everything within my power to overturn that and have a fairer and a better tax bill that will help the middle class, the shrinking middle class, and the working poor, because it's extremely, extremely sad what's happening in this country. And the kids are struggling to make ends meet. These are kids with college educations that can't find good jobs. They're frozen in time. They're struggling with their high debt from their college educations or their VOTAC educations. They're frozen in time, as I say. They're not buying homes, they're not having children, they're not getting married. These are our future. We have to provide them with a pathway to success so they're not just surviving, but that they're thriving. And I think that, again, it goes back to we all pay taxes and we expect a good return on our payments. And we can help by helping to rebuild the middle class.
Thank you, Michelle Lee. Leah Phifer, if you're elected to Congress, what are you going to do when it comes to budget and taxes? The biggest part of your job?
So I belong to a generation of public servants that doesn't remember a time when we passed a budget on time. For the past 10 years, I have waited anxiously at the end of every continuing resolution or budget year, staying up till midnight to see if I would be allowed back to work the next day. I was one of those who were furloughed 4 years ago when the government shut down, not knowing when I'd be able to go back to work. This is not just a minor annoyance. When we are focusing all our energy and resources on just passing short-term budget after short-term budget, we are losing out on the opportunity to tackle the real issues that need reform. Criminal justice reform, climate change, immigration reform. That's what we need to be focusing on, not constantly expending all our energy on trying to do the most basic job of Congress, which is to pass a budget. So in Congress, I would immediately work to turn back the tax bill that we have recently seen that we know is going to only contribute to our deficit and sunset the tax breaks for the middle class within 5 years while extending the tax breaks for large corporations into perpetuity. So in addition to reforming that tax bill, I would make sure that I'm starting early, working with my colleagues across the aisle to make sure we get a budget passed on time and can focus on real issues.
Thank you, Leah Phifer. Jason Metsa, if you're elected to Congress.
You know, taxes should really be about fairness. And the bill that we just got handed to us isn't that fair. In Minnesota in 2013 and 14, we balanced the budget by making corporations and the 1% pay their fair share. And that is how our tax bill on a federal level should work. We need to make sure that an income tax is fair. No regressive taxes should be passed on the working poor. An income tax is the fairest way to approach making sure that people who can afford to pay X amount of dollars do, and those that don't get a hand and are able to get back on their feet for whatever situation. If I'm in Congress, I'm going to make sure we focus on passing a budget that holds the 1% and our corporate counterparts accountable for what they haven't been so far.
Thank you, Jason. Joe Radinovich, your stand as a Congress member on the budget and taxes.
Yeah, so Jason and I, we were in the state legislature that year. We were elected in 2012. And the setup for that, just to give people some context, because this is important. In 2001 and 2002, I think we radically restructured the way that the taxes in the state of Minnesota work. And what we saw after that was, I think in 8 out of 10 years, there were budget deficits. And every time there were budget deficits, Democrats would propose either revenue increases or some cuts or a mix of the two. And the Republicans, who always held either the House, the Senate, or the governor's office, would never go along with them. And this is a really important fact that I bring up because as those budget deficits happened, more and more we had to cut. We were never able to raise the revenues. The impact that has on small towns across Minnesota was that we had to increase our reliance on property taxes at the city level, at the school board level, at the county level to offset those costs. And so we were asking the people who had the least to pay the most to subsidize the services where they were at. The reason I bring all this up is because this is the fundamental difference between Republicans and Democrats. There is no working across the aisle on this issue. Republicans will not vote for a tax increase, though they should in their good senses, because we need to fund the programs that people rely on in this country. We need to make child care more affordable, we need to invest in education, and we need to pass a universal single-payer health care act. And if we don't have the will to raise taxes, then we're not going to be able to do that. And what I would say is that in order to do that, we're going to need to win, not just this seat in the 8th district to take back to Congress, but we're going to need to win the Senate in 2020, and we're going to need to win the presidency. I've never seen it done any other way where there's ever been a Republican who's voted for a tax increase to fund the programs that we need, and that's why winning in this election is so important.
Thank you, Joe Radinovich. Kirsten Kennedy, if you're elected to Congress, budget, taxes.
Budget and taxes are favorite things. In the city of North Branch, as the mayor, if we don't pass a budget, we're in big trouble. And I have said this before, and I'm going to say it again, we need a fundamental restructuring of our economy. The real wealth comes from the creation of products and services that satisfy our customers and serve society, not from rigging the rules and cheating our system. As a matter of fact, we need an economy that's fair to everyone, That means structuring the system that not only rewards people for hard work and innovation, but also discourages people from cheating the system and passing costs on to the community. We need rules of the road that make economic competition open and honest. We don't have that right now. I'm going to argue that the middle class is the engine that drives our prosperity. Our economy succeeds when it grows from the middle out. Giving tax breaks, bailouts, and special treatment to Wall Street and the 1% has gotten us nowhere. I think we need a restructuring, and we need a commitment to say we're going to pass it clean, we're going to make sure that people pay their fair share, and no more bailouts.
Thank you, Kirsten Kennedy. This is a yes or no question that came in on a card, and I was dying to ask it. Leah Phifer, you get it first. Would you support refugees coming from mostly Muslim countries to the United States?
Yes.
How about you, Joe Radinovich?
Yes.
How about you, Jason Metsa?
Yes.
Stop switching seats on me. Kirsten Kennedy, would you support
I'm
refugees?
glad you got me right. Yes.
The answer is yes for you. Michelle Lee?
Yes.
I'm pleased to hear all that. There's another sort of a yes or no question. Does the federal government, this goes to Jason Metsa, does the federal government and Congress have a duty or an obligation to regulate things like Facebook and the big mess they just got us into recently with data and privacy and meddling in the election and that type of thing? Is that Congress's job? And if it is, what are you going to do about it if elected?
People have a right to make sure that they feel like their vote counts the day after the election. We need to get back to trusting election results in this country. And holding meddlers accountable is one thing that we should be doing in Washington. The fact that a foreign entity can come into this country and put advertisement in front of you when you're trying to talk to your grandkids and kids and friends is abhorrent. And we need to make sure that we have policies that stop that from happening. Freedom of speech applies to citizens of this country, not to foreign governments to come and try to influence us. We need to make sure that we also, this ties right into voting, we need to make sure that the voting system here in Minnesota is one of the best gold star standards in the country, giving people more access to no excuse early absentee voting, making sure that there's same-day registration nationwide, and that disenfranchised communities have access to make sure that people can get out and vote in their community without having to travel an unfair distance. These are all steps we can take to make sure that you think and know that your vote counts. And we need to also eliminate the electronic voting and go to paper ballots like we have here in Minnesota. It's proven in 2 recounts to be very accurate, fair, and respectable. And if I'm elected to Congress, I'll work to make sure that the things I just mentioned happen across the country.
Thank you, Joe Radinovich. Thank you, Jason Metsa. Joe Radinovich, what I was going to say was, Jason did a good job of tying those 2 questions together, even though we really asked about Facebook. It was really also about the election and voting. So as a member of Congress, where do you stand on the issue? Do you think Congress should be regulating things like Facebook and voting and our security issues?
Yes, I do think that the U.S. Congress should be regulating Facebook. Facebook is a media company. We regulate every other media company that engages in election activities in this country. Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat and whatever else people are using these days should be regulated in the same way. It's only fair. But the second component of this question really gets at the issue of election finance, which is something we've already talked about at length here. What we have are we paired up media companies that don't do much in the way of disclosure, haven't obviously kept very good track of their data, and let outside forces manipulate their platforms to sway elections. But on the other hand, what we also have that's very important is an election system that's broken and that allows money to flood in from all parts and not be properly disclaimed. And so I think that really it's one part of this question is regulating Facebook and other new media platforms, and the other is, again, getting back to that question of election finance reform and the extensive changes necessary to make sure that our elections run more properly here.
Thank you, Joe. Kirsten Kennedy, can you tell us where you stand on the Congress's meddling with things like Facebook and making sure that our elections have integrity?
Well, I think perhaps our last election, it's questionable if it did have integrity. And I think because we were not paying attention to it and we were not regulating it, as we can see now with many from those platforms, they're having to come and answer some hard questions. But more importantly, we shouldn't have to be answering those questions. We are supposed to be the forward thinkers and work on this ahead of the game. To think that foreign entities, Russia and other countries participated in our elections and perhaps swayed using those platforms, there has to be accountability, and we have to make sure it doesn't happen again. I'm not sure we're there yet. I don't know that right now people think it's that important, but I do. I also believe we have a right to privacy, and I believe in net neutrality, and I think it is a brave new world, and we have to figure it out, because this is a global issue, and there are countries that have figured it out and came down hard on anyone trying to interfere with their elections.
Thank you, Kirsten. Michelle Lee, on the issue of the Facebook and security breaches, voting, what's Congress's role, and what would you do as a member?
I think we definitely have to regulate websites like Facebook, because folks, you know about the fake news, what we see on a daily basis, and the information by us simply participating in a source like Facebook, how much information or private information is being paired and shared throughout the country. Whether you play Farmville or Candy Crush, you're sending out a lot of your personal information to complete strangers who can play with that information, and then they can create informative commercials to influence you down the line. You're not even aware of it. So we need to figure out how they're doing this, and I know that they're holding hearings and they're talking to the Facebook guys, and they're going to figure this out, but we need to regulate this, and we have to proceed carefully. I'm also for net neutrality, excuse me, sometimes my mouth gets ahead of my brain.
So does mine.
Yeah, so net neutrality is essential. I think the internet has really opened up the whole world to many of us. Other countries have a chance to see how great America is. Our kids are connected with the world and they're learning, so we have to be careful of what our kids are seeing and what they're doing, and I think that goes back to government oversight and the assurances that these things are regulated.
Thank you, Michelle Lee. Leah Phifer, can you tell us what you're going to do as a member of Congress on the Facebook security breach and on the voting debacle that we had in the last election?
Absolutely. I believe Congress absolutely should be working with Facebook and Twitter and other social media platforms to ensure that foreign countries and outside organizations are not able to infiltrate our elections and influence the outcome of our elections like they did in 2016. But this speaks to a greater problem. And the greater problem is where the United States is putting our resources when it comes to defense. We are pouring billions, trillions of dollars into traditional defense mechanisms, overseas wars, more tanks, more drones, while we are neglecting to protect some of our most fragile and important infrastructure systems. Healthcare. We have documented instances of foreign entities hacking into our healthcare systems, into our energy grids, into our banks, and yes, into our election systems. So I would immediately advocate that the government begins to recruit the best and the brightest, who we are currently losing to Facebook and Amazon and Twitter, so that they can come and work for Uncle Sam instead of working for Twitter. I would also advocate that we loosen up the restrictions on the marijuana use policy and our security clearance process, because we are missing out on some of the best and the brightest minds in cybersecurity with our current process.
Thank you, Leah. Oh, hackers are stoners, I get it. Okay, well, we're moving on to Joe Radinovich now. I thought I made another blunder, Joe, sorry. But you do have the next question, and this is about the wall. This is Trump came up with this great idea that he can convince people that he should be president by building a wall and talking about immigration. Is this something that you are going to have anything to do with when you're elected to Congress?
No, I won't have anything to do with building a wall.
Then what would you do to stop it?
What would I do to stop this? Well, I think that number one, the wall is flawed for a number of reasons. One, because it's a Donald Trump idea, and so inherently it's flawed. He knows what he's doing, and he's dividing people against one another. And what he's identified as an anxiety in the economy. He's telling people who have seen the difficulties brought by a changing economy that we can blame someone specifically for their problems. So in this case he's pointing to the Mexicans. In other cases he points to Muslims or the Chinese or whatever else it is. I mean, the security issues we have in this country are not going to be addressed by a physical barrier on the Mexican border. In fact, many of the people who are here as an undocumented person right now have overstayed visas, were allowed into this country legally, and very likely came through an airport or some other port of entry. And so this is a gimmick. It's something designed to pit the American people against one another, and I don't think it's a very effective solution for our economic issues, which are driving this anxiety, or for our immigration issues, which are of a different nature.
Thank you. Kirsten Kennedy, when you're in Congress, how are you going to address this wall?
Well, I'm not going to fund it. I'm not going to support it, because the fact is that crossings by undocumented people are down, way down. And if you talk to border security that works now, they have issues that have nothing to do with people crossing. This is an issue as a nation of immigrants. This defines us, I think, as, are we going to live in fear, or are we going to get things right? And while it might be a really smoke and mirrors type of thing to talk about the wall, let's talk about infrastructure. And I think if we move it to, instead of spending trillions or billions on the wall, let's rebuild America, then we can change the conversation, because sometimes that's what it's going to take, is changing the conversations. You might not change people's minds that are set on the wall, but no one can argue that America really needs some work on infrastructure.
Thank you, Kirsten Kennedy. Michelle Lee, if you're elected to Congress and you're serving and all of a sudden this wall issue comes up, which it will, what are you going to do?
Vote no. Just say no, simply. We all know that China had a Great Wall. Well, how did that work out? Donald Trump rode to victory pointing a finger at people who he called bad hombres. They're going to come in, they're going to rape us, they're going to kill us. And he frightened his base. And he kept hitting home that he was going to build this wall to keep those bad people out of this country. First, Mexico was going to pay for it. Then America may be paying for it. And now he's going to get the money out of the military fund. That's a lot of money, and we could be putting that to a lot of good uses. Number one, building out our infrastructure, maybe providing that free education to public community colleges and VOTECs for our young adults, so they're not saddled with such steep debt that they can move on and have those babies and build those homes and become a very, kids today should be able to live better than I did. My kid should have a better future than what my husband and I did. We have to start making sense in our decisions of what's happening out there in Washington. Building a wall where people will always find a taller ladder. They'll always be able to dig a tunnel under a wall no matter what you do. We have to start thinking rationally again. We have to start questioning leaders, questioning the president when he makes these tweets that start causing these divisive things that separate each and every one of us. We know what's right, but pretty soon with the fake news and what he's tweeting daily, we get really confused. Where is this country going? And I think that's all up to each and every one of us. Maybe shut down the Facebook. Maybe stop looking at your phone. Maybe start talking to one another. Look into each other's eyes and find out what you really feel is important. And you know what? Maybe that's what I think is important too. And when there's two of us, pretty soon there's four, and pretty soon we have an army who can take this country back.
Thank you, Michelle Lee. Leah, if you are elected to Congress, where do you stand on the wall?
So Donald Trump is not the only one who believes in this wall. The GOP candidate in the 8th District stated the other night in our last forum that he is a big believer in building Donald Trump's wall. And he stated specifically he believes in building the wall because he thinks it's going to stop human traffickers and drug smugglers. And you know what? Maybe a lot of moderate or conservative-leaning people will believe him. Pete has 23 years of law enforcement experience. Maybe I should believe him when he says this wall will work. What we need as DFLers is someone who has spent 10 years working with human traffickers, documenting stories, documenting what has happened when drugs cross the border, who can push back and say, Pete, you're not fooling anyone. This wall is the worst idea that we could ever engage in to combat these issues that you claim are infiltrating our country. We need to recognize that it isn't just Donald Trump who's pushing this idea. There are people in our own district who want to trust both Pete Stauber and Donald Trump when they say a wall is needed. So we need someone with experience who can stand up and say, I've worked in this area and a wall is not needed.
Thank you. Jason, when you're elected to Congress, where do you stand on the wall issue?
You know, we should be building our country's infrastructure based on the hopes, needs, and aspirations of our communities and what they want to aspire to. And the wall is about building with fear. We should not be building things based on fear. And we all know that we have a lot of infrastructure needs in this country. Every community here, I see it at the Capitol, every year the last 6 years, has a wastewater treatment plant that needs an upgrade. A street that has pipes under it that need to be replaced. The roads themselves. And when you look at the numbers on this wall, it's 10%, $20 billion out of what Trump's proposed for the country, a $200 billion infrastructure bill. I think that $20 billion would go much further, adding it to the number he already had to invest in our infrastructure. And if I'm in Congress, I'll work to make sure that we have those investments brought home here instead of building walls.
Thank you, Joe.
That's Jason.
Jason. I did that on purpose that time. You didn't really notice.
I'm going to pay for a dinner with you and my dad.
Kirsten, I want to ask you a frank question that all the candidates are going to get. To beat Pete Stauber, you're going to need a lot of money. Are you able to raise enough money to run a competitive race against Pete Stauber this fall?
Well, I'm going to be quite honest. I hate making phone calls to ask for money. I do. And I've made a pledge not to take from PACs. I've made a pledge to try to keep it clean and not have it be about money. But guess what? As was mentioned before, the last race was $30 million. I think that this will also be an expensive race, and I know there will be an outside money coming in. We'll need to raise $3 million, each of us, which is what, or more, and then outside money will come in. I'm absolutely committed to raising what I need to raise and going out and making the hard phone calls. But more importantly, I believe that to have a candidate that we get behind, having an endorsed candidate, I believe that will be helpful. If it doesn't happen, going to a primary, each candidate will have to make a decision about that. But yes, I'm committed to raising the funds.
Thank you, Kirsten Kennedy. Michelle Lee, are you able to raise enough money to beat Pete Stauber this fall?
I believe that I'm as able as anyone here at this table to raise that money.
Thank you, Michelle Lee. Leah Phifer, how about you?
Absolutely. And I want to take a moment to talk about, as Kirsten mentioned, the importance of the DFL endorsement in this entire process. April 14th is the endorsing convention. If we don't get an endorsed candidate on April 14th, the national groups that have been supporting this district for many, many years will pack up and go home. They are not going to wait for us to duke it out until August and then suddenly come swooping in the last 2 months while Pete Stauber has had the entire summer to build up his base and build up his money. We need an endorsed candidate, and we need all of the candidates to rally around that person, because this is keeping the 8th District blue. So absolutely we need money to win this seat, but we also need a winning message and the time to get it out there to the people of the 8th District.
Thank you. Jason Metsa, are you able to raise that money?
We've raised enough so far to be able to bring 6 people on board, which I'm proud to be a job creator in the district right now. And we're going to have a field team that we need to fund to make sure that we're out there talking to voters and listening to them about what they want to see out their next congressperson. And I'm going to make sure that the resources are there to do that.
Thank you, Jason. Joe, are you able to raise the money needed to take on Pete Stauber this fall?
Yeah, I am able to raise the money necessary to take on Pete Stauber, and I want to talk about some of the difficult elections that I've been a part of. In 2012, I won one of the top 2 or 3 most competitive legislative seats in the district, and I did it by knocking the second most amount of doors of any Democratic candidate in the state of Minnesota and raising a sufficient amount for a first-timer. The next time I wasn't happy with that progress, and I was in a very, very tough race. It was made more tough because of my support for marriage equality, despite my district's firm and adamant opposition to it. I persevered through a recall attempt, and in that election I lost narrowly, but because I believed in what we were doing, and because I believed in the stakes at hand, I went out there and I knocked more doors than any other House Democrat in the state of Minnesota, and my district was all of Hagen County and half of Crow Wing County. And so you can imagine how many dirt roads that meant, bringing the message to people one at a time and engaging in grassroots politics. But I also raised more than any House candidate that year who wasn't self-funding. And so what I believe is that campaigns are about 3 things, not just one thing, 3 things. The 3 things are a message that unite Democrats with the independents that we're going to need to win in this district, and that's about the changing economy and how we equip workers in the face of that changing economy. The second thing that we're going to need is a grassroots base, and in the first 24 hours of our campaign, we signed up 150 volunteers, and we're bringing them on board, and we're engaging them, and we're getting them across the district. That's based on the network I've had before. And the third thing is money, and it's an unfortunate thing. We've all talked about the necessary changes that we want to see in campaign finance, but in order to take that message and make sure that everybody hears it, we have to be able to raise enough money. And I am actually skeptical that everybody on this stage is going to be able to do that, because the money that we raise as Democrats is based on the coalition that we need to hold together in order to win. And those are folks who, are labor unions and progressive organizations, and what we need to do is make sure that their members are on board with these candidacies. And so some of the things that have been said over the course of this time are designed to break up our party and to divide it. And I think that we need to unite, because we cannot win this campaign without uniting the Democratic base with the independent voters necessary to win.
Thank you, Joe. Michelle Lee, I want to ask you, if you're elected to Congress, what your stance is on education. It's a big department in our country. Congress funds it, and I want to know where you stand.
Well, education is the great equalizer in this country. Right now we have teachers who are teaching their classes with moldy books in some parts of this country. Teachers are striking in other states because they're not paid enough to do what they need to do. As we all know, our teachers are our mentors. They sometimes are babysitters. We ask so much of our teachers. So we have to come up with a system where our teachers are well paid, so we can start retaining them. Within the first 5 years, I believe, of a new teacher, there's 20% attrition. These people just get out because they can't teach. They don't want to teach, given the current conditions in our classrooms. So number one, we have to do everything possible to shore up our educational system, preschool through preschool through 12. Our schools, our elementary schools, our middle schools, and our high schools, they're the heartbeat of our communities, and we need to do everything under our power to support them, because our kids need to be educated. They also need to move on to whether it's a VOTEC or whether it's a 2-year college or a 4-year college. Education is key, and we say, if we're talking about battleships, we're talking about supplying more and more billions and billions and trillions of dollars to our military. But we have to start focusing in on taking some of that money and pouring it into our educational system, because that's where the battles are going to be fought.
Thank you, Michelle Lee. Leah Phifer, if you're elected to Congress, what's your stance on education?
As far as higher education goes, I am on record as being a strong supporter of Bernie Sanders' College for All Act. It's the only way that we are going to allow people to actually access the human right that is education in this country. So as having gone on record for that, what I want to talk about instead is a person named Metsa DeVos and what she's doing to our K-12 system right now, specifically with her push for school vouchers. School vouchers, make no bones about it, school vouchers and a rise in that program will cause a closure of many, many rural schools that are already suffering under the weight of closing schools across rural areas. Not to mention, school vouchers have also proven to exacerbate the racial and income disparities that we in Minnesota are already struggling with one of the largest, sometimes the largest, depending on trading places between us and Alabama, the worst and largest achievement gap in the nation already exists in Minnesota. By implementing and increasing the school voucher system, we are only going to make that problem even worse. So in Congress, I will make sure that Betsy DeVos is not allowed to gut our educational system that way.
Thank you. Jason Metsa, if you're elected to Congress, your education stance.
You know, public education is one of the great equalizers in this country, and I am proud that I was able to work in my first term to make historic investments in our K through 12, our pre-K, and champion a bill called Paid Family and Medical Leave, which would give people access when they have young kids to be able to be home and take care of them. And we need to have free 4-year tuition. People deserve not to be straddling debt. My wife, Amanda, graduated from McAllister and came home with a mortgage, essentially, $100,000 for her college degree. It is unfair to saddle generations with debt like that, where it takes you your whole career to pay things off. And if I'm in Congress, I'm going to work to make sure that whether you go to school in Minneapolis or in Cloquet, that you have the resources you need so that the next generation has the tools to do a little bit better than us.
Thank you, Jason. Joe Radinovich, education in Congress.
Yeah, the reason I got involved in politics in the first place was because of education. And so my first involvement in government of any level was when I went to a school board meeting in the 8th grade. I went alone without my parents. There were about 500 people in the town of Crosby that went to that meeting. Crosby is a town of about 2,200 people. What was on the docket that night was a set of cuts that would drastically change the opportunities available to students in the district. They were going to cut the late bus, they were going to cut shop classes, they were going to cut the German language, they were going to cut sports programs and things at the elementary school and all sorts of that. And we all showed up there, and in a small town, people understand the importance of education. They're very earnest about it, and at one point a woman stood up and she said, I've got a solution to fill this $500,000 budget cut. We'll say sell rubber bands that say band together for CI schools on them for $1 a piece. Everybody in that room and about 10 other rooms would have had to have 20 armbands up and down their arm to try and plug that gap. That's how much people both understand why it's important and that they're so earnest in their attempts to fix it. But the problem that we had in Crosby Arrington was that same meeting happened every year, and that school board never had any option. They were playing the cards that they were dealt by the state level. And so what I think we need to do, both at the state level and at the federal level, is make sure that we take care of our obligation to allow people to have opportunities pre-K, because we know that for every dollar we spend on early childhood education, we see $16 in return. We have a robust kindergarten through 12 program, including making sure that the federal government makes good on their obligation to fund special education. That's something that they haven't done in 40 years. They call it the cross subsidy, and it's pitting people who need those services against those who can least afford them, the school districts can least afford them. And the third thing I think is we need to have free community and technical colleges so everybody can train and retrain the economy as it changes and as is necessary in their life.
Thank you. Kirsten Kennedy, if you're elected to Congress.
Well, as the mother of a third-year teacher who teaches Arabic, I know that our teachers are underpaid. They are not supported. We need fully funded public education, K through 12, with help for college and technical schools. While it is the great equalizer, we need to put our money where our mouth is, and we need to fund it. We need licensed teachers that make a good wage, not a wage where they have to be afraid or have to live in a 2-income family to even be a teacher. We need to bring incentives to teachers and loan forgiveness for teachers that will teach in greater Minnesota or in rural areas. We need loan forgiveness programs for all teachers. We need progressive ratios of support staff and services to all students. We need vocational and trade options in our high schools. We are one of the only industrialized nations that do not do that. In other countries, when you graduate from high school, you basically have an AA degree. We need to do that more. We need to partner. We need to fund education. We need to stop tearing people down about policies. People got voted in. We have government that have leaders that we like and we don't like, but it's our responsibility as elected officials to work across the aisle and get it right and make commitments to our teachers. We have some of the lowest paid teachers in the entire world.
Kirsten, thank you. Now, to wrap up this forum tonight, candidates, I'd like to ask you to tell us in a minute or less why you think you should be elected to Congress and what makes you think that you can be our candidate to beat Pete Stauber this fall? Leah Phifer?
As I mentioned earlier, Pete is going to campaign on a strong law enforcement background and being a hockey star and the deep, deep ties that he has to this district. We need a DFLer who can go toe-to-toe with him on all of those issues. As was mentioned earlier, this district did go 16 points for Donald Trump. So we need someone who can speak to the independents and the frustrated Republicans, particularly frustrated Republican women. So if we put forth a DFL candidate with a strong law enforcement background, deep ties to the district, a strong economic plan for the district, who also speaks very strongly to the issues that can court Republican women, we absolutely can build a strong enough coalition to keep this seat blue.
Thank you. Jason Metsa, why should we endorse you for this seat, and what makes you think you can beat Pete Stauber this fall?
You know, what people really want right now is hope. I remember my wife crawling into bed after the election, wondering what life was going to be like for our family moving forward. We talked that night and we determined we lost this fight, but we're going to get up. We are fighters. The Democrats in this district are fighters, and we're going to take the next one to the mat and keep this district blue. Overall, I've got a track record in St. Paul of getting results, passing a minimum wage increase, making sure that women have a level playing field at work. I have put my money where my mouth is, and I fight for what's right, not what's popular. And that's not always easy to do. Moving forward in this, I've outperformed Congressman Nolan in my district 3 times by 3.5 points. Making sure that I can replicate that across the range, where we are seeing folks who are a little disappointed with where our party's heading, because we're not talking about the opportunity for their kids and making sure that our government's investing the resources in jobs up here and making sure that the next generation has the tools, equipment, and education to make sure that they can thrive and raise their kids here. If I'm elected, I'm going to work to make sure that our kids from this district can stay here and raise their families.
Joe Radinovich, why should we elect you to Congress, and what makes you think you can beat Pete Stauber?
Well, I appreciate the question, Pete. I thought it might be election night by the time I got off this panel here. Next time I think I'm going to bring a snack up here. But it's been a great opportunity, and I want to thank you all for being here tonight. This is great, having an opportunity to hear the candidates on all the issues, and I know that we've got a lot of fine candidates here. But I would say this, that what we don't need to be talking about are national security issues and intelligence community issues. What we need to be talking about are the bread and butter issues that unite the Democratic base in this district with the independence necessary to win this race. We've seen this template before. We watched Congressman Nolan do it. We watched Congressman Oberstar do it. We even watched Chip Gravac do it at some level because people identify with his union background and the values that he held. Now, they were the wrong values, and that was proven out over the next 2 years. But here's what we need to do. We need to talk about the difficulty that workers are facing in the economy. We need to offer them hope, and we need to offer them courage. Because we cannot go back in time to better days. There are some people that would have us blame our problems on Mexicans or Muslims or on the Chinese. The problems we face can't be changed by addressing those issues. The problems that we face can be changed by investing in the people of this district, and that means affordable child care, affordable education, and single-payer universal health care. Those are the things that will keep people in our party and in our coalition, and those are the things that are going to help us win in November. That message.
Thank you. Kirsten Kennedy, why should we give you the endorsement for this race in Congress, and what makes you think you can beat Pete Stauber?
Well, I'm gonna not talk about Pete Stauber. I'm gonna talk about who I think we are. I think we stand up for what is right. We fight for moral reasons. We pass laws, strike down laws for moral reasons. We wage war on poverty, not poor people. We sacrifice and care for our neighbors. We put money where our mouths are, and we never beat our chest. We build great infrastructure, make technological advances, explore the universe, cure diseases, and we cultivate the world's greatest artists and the world's greatest economy. We reach for the stars. We welcome immigrants. We don't separate families or criminalize the innocent and deport people. We aspire to intelligence, and we don't belittle it. We're not afraid of it.
and we're not afraid of it because it doesn't make us feel inferior. We don't identify ourselves with who we voted for in the last election, and we don't scare so easy. We are able to be all of these things and do all of these things because we are informed by leaders who vote for what they believe in, who recognize a free press is critical, leaders who understand that never-ending wars, building walls, bowing to Russia, mass deportations, zero diplomacy, inequity in private prison incarcerations do not make us safer. Leaders committed to passing legislation that is good for the majority of Americans, not corporate donors. Leaders committed to a fundamental restructuring of our economy. Leaders who are really willing to roll up their sleeves and get it done one day at a time, working together. I am that leader.
Michelle Lee, why should we endorse you for Congress, and what makes you think you can beat Pete Stauber?
I'm in this race because I believe it's time for a new politic, a time to advocate on behalf of those who left our party in recent years. We used to be one of the most blue parts of America. Now we have counties in this district that vote 70% or more Republican. I know there are many others who feel like me. It's time we broaden our horizons and boldly advocate for change that appeals to those who left the DFL party for the other side or just decided to stay home rather than even bother to vote. These past few weeks on the campaign trail have allowed me to share a wide range of my own beliefs. I know some of you who had your minds made up, you're now giving me a second chance. You're giving me a second look, and I thank you very much for that. So I'm reaching out to you and others in our party, the great DFL party, Democrat, Farmer, Labor, and others throughout this district who are looking for someone to give a voice, that's right, a voice to their hopes for a better future for themselves and their families. I ask you tonight, take a few minutes and read through my Facebook, my website posts. Please learn more about me. And know this, I will never put special interests before your interests. I will go to Washington to conduct the people's business. And that is what it is all about. It's your business. This is the business we all need to conduct. Thank you.
These are the candidates on behalf of the organizers. I'm Peter Stauber. Thanks for coming tonight.
Check out my website. I'm on record. You can check out my website. I'm on record as not supporting the current proposal.
That didn't work so good. Oh, yeah, good to see you.
Where's the bathroom?
Did you get it back on there? Yeah. Okay.